The morning sun crept over the Bitterroot Mountains like a slow exhale, painting the Montana sky in shades of amber and rust. Margaret Sinclair stood on her front porch, a chipped ceramic mug warming her weathered hands. Steam rose from the coffee in lazy spirals, disappearing into air so cold it burned the lungs. 73 years had carved deep lines into her face, lines that spoke of laughter and loss of secrets buried so deep they had become part of the bedrock. Her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun caught the early light like spun steel. She had stopped dyeing it 8 years ago, the day Edward died. No point in vanity when the only man who had ever really seen her was gone. The ranch sprawled out before her, 50 acres of Montana wilderness purchased with cash 15 years ago from a seller who did not ask questions. The kind of property that offered three things Margaret valued above all else: isolation, defendable terrain, and sightlines clear enough to see trouble coming from a mile away. She took a long sip of her coffee, savoring the bitter edge. French roast, black, no sugar. Edward used to tease her about it. Woman drinks motor oil and calls it breakfast, he would say, grinning that crooked grin that had first caught her attention in a dive bar in Falls Church, Virginia, back in 1996. A lifetime ago. A different woman entirely. Her eyes swept the property with practiced efficiency. The main house weathered cedar and stone, built to withstand brutal Montana winters. The barn gray wood silvered by decades of harsh weather, its doors hanging slightly crooked on iron hinges. The chicken coop, where 6 Rhode Island Reds scratched and pecked, blissfully unaware that their owner had once interrogated a Czech intelligence officer in a basement that officially did not exist. Everything appeared normal, peaceful, safe. The gravel crunched beneath her boots as she walked toward the garden. Early October meant the last of the lavender needed harvesting before the first hard frost. She had planted it in neat rows every spring, purple and fragrant. The kind of thing a retired woman would do. The kind of thing Margaret Sinclair, widow former elementary school nurse, devoted churchgoer, would absolutely do. She knelt beside the lavender beds, her knees protesting with familiar aches. Arthritis had claimed her left hand 3 years ago. The right one still worked fine. The right one still remembered how to field strip a Glock 19 in 17 seconds flat, though she had not tested that particular skill in over a decade. The photograph rested on the mantel inside, right where she could see it every morning. Edward Sinclair, 59 years old, Army Ranger turned contractor turned her husband for 18 years. Cancer had taken him slow and mean, the kind of death that made strong men beg for mercy. He never did. Stubborn Irish bastard held on with both hands until the very end, squeezing her fingers so hard she thought the bones might crack. "You cannot save everyone, Maggie," he had whispered in those final hours, his voice nothing but rasp and rattle. "You tried. God knows you tried, but you cannot save everyone." She had kissed his forehead, tasted salt and sickness, and lied to him with a smile. "I know, love, I know." But she did not know. Not really. Because the truth Margaret Sinclair had learned over 7 decades of living and 3 decades of classified service was simpler and more terrible than that. You cannot save everyone. But that does not mean you stop trying. She missed him every morning. Missed the weight of him beside her in bed. Missed the way he hummed while he made breakfast, always slightly off-key, always the same 3 Johnny Cash songs. Missed the way he would stand behind her while she washed dishes, his arms around her waist, his chin on her shoulder, not saying anything because he did not need to. The silence between them had always been the comfortable kind, the kind that spoke louder than words. He had known about her past, not the details, not the operations or the code names or the classified files that filled entire rooms in buildings that officially did not exist. But he had known the shape of it, had seen the way she checked exits when they entered a restaurant, had noticed the satellite phone she kept charged in a drawer she thought he did not know about, had understood, without being told, that the woman he married carried scars that were not all visible. He never asked. That was the gift he gave her. Not ignorance, but acceptance. The understanding that some questions are better left unasked, that some truths are too heavy to share and too dangerous to speak aloud. She had loved him for that. Among 1,000 other reasons, she had loved him for the simple grace of not needing to know everything. The sound hit her ears before her brain could process what it meant. A crash, metal on metal, the sick crunch of chrome and steel meeting asphalt at speed. Then silence. The kind of silence that came after violence, heavy and waiting. Margaret's body reacted before her mind caught up. The coffee mug dropped from her hands, shattering on the porch steps. She was already moving boots, eating up the gravel driveway in long strides. Her right hand instinctively reached for her hip fingers, closing on empty air. The Glock was inside, locked in the false bottom of her bedroom dresser, where it had sat untouched for 8 years. She rounded the curve in her mile-long driveway and stopped cold. 3 motorcycles lay twisted in the gravel like broken insects. Harley-Davidson's heavy touring bikes, their chrome catching the morning light at impossible angles. One had skidded 20 feet, leaving a dark smear of oil and something else across the pale stones. Another rested on its side front wheel, still spinning slowly. The third had crashed into the drainage ditch, its rider thrown clear. Blood. So much blood. 3 men sprawled across her driveway. All of them wore leather vests, black and worn, with patches that marked them as Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club. All of them were bleeding. All of them were dying. 73-year-old women would have screamed. Most would have run for their phones, fingers trembling as they dialed 911. Most would have stood frozen in shock, unable to process the sudden violence that had shattered their peaceful morning. Margaret Sinclair was not most women. She walked toward the first man with measured steps. Her mind had already shifted gears, clicking into a mode she had not accessed in years, but never forgot. Combat triage. Assess, prioritize, act. The mantra of every field medic who had ever worked under fire. The biggest one lay closest to the house. 6'3", at least, built like a barn door with graying temples and a beard that had been neatly trimmed before someone had used his face as a punching bag. His leather vest bore patches that identified him as Road Captain. A name patch read Reaper in bold letters. Blood seeped from a gash across his scalp, matting his dark hair into sticky clumps. She knelt beside him, fingers finding his carotid artery. Pulse present, thready but there. Breathing shallow but regular. Skull fracture, possible concussion, certain. She had seen worse. Much worse. In field hospitals where the floor was slick with blood and the air tasted of copper and fear. In safe houses where the wounded came in the dark and left before dawn, if they left at all. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking for additional injuries. 3 broken ribs on the left side. Road rash across his forearms, the kind of damage that came from sliding across asphalt at 50 miles per hour. But he would live, if she could stop the head from bleeding, if she could prevent shock, if she could keep his airway clear. The second man was younger, maybe late 30s, with arms like fence posts and a face that had been handsome before someone rearranged its features with their fists, his left arm bent at an angle that made her jaw tighten. Compound fracture, the bone pressing against skin that had not quite broken through. His name patch read Axel. She checked his vitals. Pulse weak, breathing labored, internal bleeding possible. The arm would need surgery eventually, but she could stabilize it. Buy him time. Keep him breathing until help arrived. If help arrived. The third man was barely more than a boy, 25 at most, with blonde hair matted with blood. Someone had worked him over with something heavier than fists. A crowbar maybe, or a length of pipe. His breathing came in shallow gasps that rattled wetly in his chest. When she peeled back his eyelids, one pupil was significantly larger than the other. Concussion, possibly severe, possibly fatal if not treated. His vest identified him as a prospect, the newest member still proving himself. His name patch read Smoke. Margaret sat back on her heels and surveyed the scene with clinical detachment. 3 men beaten nearly to death left in her driveway like garbage dumped on the side of the road. Their motorcycles destroyed with methodical precision. Fuel tanks ruptured, engines cracked, electrical systems torn apart. This had not been random violence. This had been professional, calculated. Someone had wanted information from these men. When they did not get it, they decided to make a point, and they had chosen her driveway to make it. A cold thought curled through her mind like smoke, not chosen at random. Nothing about this was random. Her driveway, her property. 50 acres at the end of a road that led nowhere except to her front door. She pushed the thought aside. There would be time for analysis later. Right now, 3 men were dying, and that was the only equation that mattered. The barn stood weathered and gray against the Montana sky, its paint peeling, its boards warped by decades of harsh winters. To anyone passing by, it looked like nothing more than an old storage building filled with rusted farm equipment and forgotten memories. They would be wrong. Margaret's arthritic fingers moved with surprising precision across the combination lock hidden behind a loose board near the entrance. The numbers came to her without thought, burned into muscle memory by years of repetition. 3 turns left, 2 right, 1 left again. The lock clicked open. Inside the barn smelled of dust and hay and motor oil. Cobwebs draped across forgotten tools like funeral shrouds. But Margaret walked past all of it with purpose, her boots leaving prints in the undisturbed dust as she moved toward the far corner where a stack of hay bales had stood untouched for 2 decades. She moved the bales aside with effort that made her shoulders ache. Beneath them, hidden under a layer of rotted canvas, sat a steel case that had not been opened in 8 years. Military-grade designed to survive drops from aircraft and submersion in salt water. Its surface bore no markings, no serial numbers, nothing that could identify its origin or owner. She had carried it across 3 continents, through border crossings that existed in no official records, past customs agents who had been paid to look the other way. It had been with her in Prague and Budapest, and a dozen other cities whose names she had sworn never to speak aloud. Her fingers found the biometric scanner disguised as a simple clasp. It read her fingerprint and clicked open with a soft hiss of released pressure. Inside, arranged with the precision of a surgeon's instruments, lay the tools of her former life. Medical supplies occupied the top tray. Field dressings, suture kits, morphine ampoules, and sealed glass antibiotics that were technically expired but still potent. Everything needed to keep a man alive when the nearest hospital might as well be on the moon. Below them rested a Glock 19 in a worn leather holster. Its magazine still full, its action still smooth despite the years. She had cleaned it religiously every 6 months the way Edward had taught her, the way her first instructor at the farm had drilled into her. A weapon is only useful if it works when you need it. Beside the gun sat 3 passports, each bearing her photograph but different names: Elena Rohr, Catherine Wolfe, Sarah Davidson. Identities she had worn like masks slipping in and out of lives that existed only on paper. She had not looked at them in 8 years, had not needed to, until now. Margaret lifted the medical supplies and carried them back into the morning light. The sun had climbed higher, warming the air, making the blood on her driveway glisten wet and red. She had maybe an hour before someone came looking, maybe less. She worked fast. The big one, Reaper, remained conscious throughout, gritting his teeth against the pain as she maneuvered him onto an old wheelbarrow from the barn. He was heavy, easily 220 pounds, all muscle and bone, and stubborn determination not to scream. She had seen that look before on soldiers who had taken shrapnel and refused to cry out because their brothers were watching. "What is your name?" she asked, more to keep him conscious than out of genuine curiosity. "Boone." The word came out through clenched teeth. "Boone Gallagher. That is Rowan Kessler. We call him Axel. And the kid is Dalton Finch. Smoke." She nodded, committing the names to memory. Not that she needed to. She always remembered the ones she saved. And the ones she could not. It took her nearly 40 minutes to move all 3 men into her house. 40 minutes of sweat and strain and muscles that screamed in protest. She arranged Boone on her living room couch, the worn leather creaking under his weight. The other 2 she placed on air mattresses dragged down from the attic, positioning them where she could monitor them easily. By the time she finished, her shoulders burned with exertion and her lower back sang a symphony of pain. She braced her hands against the kitchen counter, catching her breath, listening. The house was quiet. Outside wind whispered through the pine trees. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as it hunted. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, they would not last. She moved through her home with purpose that would have seemed strange to anyone watching. From the false bottom in her bedroom dresser, she retrieved a satellite phone that had not been used in 8 years. Its battery was dead, but she had a charger hidden in the same compartment. Soviet-era technology built to last through nuclear winter. From behind a loose board in the basement, she pulled out a waterproof case containing emergency cash, gold coins, and documents that could get her across any border in the world within 48 hours. Escape routes she had memorized and updated quarterly, even during retirement. Old habits died hard. Old paranoia died harder. And from a hidden compartment in her kitchen pantry, concealed behind a row of mason jars filled with raspberry preserves, she took out something she had hoped never to touch again. The Glock 19 felt familiar in her hands. Its weight settled into her palm like an old friend returning after a long absence. Every curve and edge remembered by muscles that had not forgotten their training despite 15 years of peace. She checked the magazine, still full. 15 rounds of hollow point ammunition she had loaded herself before burying the weapon in her pantry. She chambered around with a practiced motion that would have shocked anyone who knew her only as Margaret Sinclair, the woman who brought homemade jam to church socials. The sound of engines broke the morning quiet. Margaret moved to the window without thinking, the satellite phone forgotten on the counter. Through the gap in the curtains, she could see them. 4 black SUVs cresting the hill at the end of her driveway, moving fast but controlled. Professional approach. Military spacing. Her blood went cold. Not because she was afraid. Margaret Sinclair had not felt fear in its purest form since Prague 1984. What she felt was something older and more dangerous. Recognition. She knew this pattern, knew the way professional operators moved when they were closing in on a target, knew the spacing between vehicles that allowed each to provide covering fire for the others, knew the deliberate speed that said, "We are not in a hurry because we already know you cannot run." She had used this exact approach herself, twice in Berlin, once in Budapest, once in a small town in northern Italy whose name appeared on no intelligence briefing. The 3 bikers were still unconscious or sleeping vulnerable and defenseless. She could not protect them and fight at the same time. She would have to be clever. The hidden cellar beneath her kitchen had been Edward's idea, one of many modifications he had helped her make to the property over the years. He had never asked why his wife wanted a concealed room with reinforced walls and a separate ventilation system. He had simply loved her enough to trust that she had her reasons. God, she missed him. The entrance was hidden behind a set of flour sacks stacked against the pantry wall. Margaret moved them aside quickly, revealing a trapdoor that opened onto a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Boone stirred as she entered the living room. "What is happening, Company?" Margaret replied, her voice steady, the unwelcome kind. She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as he stumbled toward the kitchen. His eyes widened when he saw the hidden entrance. "Lady, who the hell are you?" "Someone who made a lot of enemies a long time ago." She guided him down the first few steps. "Now help me with your friends. We do not have much time." It took precious minutes to move Rowan and Dalton into the cellar. Precious minutes during which Margaret could hear the SUVs coming to a stop outside car doors, opening boots hitting gravel. But finally, all 3 bikers were safely hidden below, and she slid the trapdoor, closed, and replaced the flour sacks with practiced ease. "Stay quiet," she told them through the floor. "No matter what you hear, you stay down there, and you stay quiet." "Understand," Boone's voice came back muffled but clear. "What are you going to do?" Margaret did not answer. She smoothed her silver hair, adjusted her cardigan, slipped the Glock into the small of her back concealed beneath the loose fabric of her house dress. Then she walked toward the front door with the shuffling gait of a woman whose joints ached on cold mornings. She opened the door to find 4 men on her porch. They were younger than she had expected. Late 20s to early 30s, with hard eyes and scarred knuckles that spoke of men who had grown up fighting. The largest wore a leather vest with a serpent patch that identified him as a member of a motorcycle club. But the other 3 were different. They wore no identifying marks, and their weapons were held with the casual confidence of professional operators. Military haircuts, alert postures, eyes that swept the environment, constantly cataloging threats and exits. Mercenaries, private military contractors hired to provide muscle for whatever operation was in play. The largest man stepped forward. His vest identified him as Marcus Ledford, though the patch beneath the serpent read simply Viper in Gothic lettering. "Morning, ma'am." His voice carried a politeness so thin it was nearly transparent. "Name is Marcus. We are looking for some friends of ours. 3 men on motorcycles. They might be hurt." "You seen anything?" Margaret allowed a slight tremor to enter her hands, clutching the doorframe as if for support. She had played this role before in a dozen different countries under a dozen different names. The frightened elderly woman was a mask that fit as comfortably as her own skin. "Motorcycles." Her voice quavered perfectly. Just the right amount of confusion and concern. "Oh my goodness. You mean those awful machines I heard last night?" "The noise woke me from a dead sleep, it did. Scared me half to death. But I have not seen anyone." "No. Is everything all right? Should I be worried?" Marcus's eyes swept past her into the house, searching for signs of occupancy or disturbance. She had been careful. The medical supplies were hidden, the blood cleaned up, any evidence that three men had been dragged through her home erased with the thoroughness of someone who had spent decades covering tracks. "Mind if we look around?" one of the contractors asked. His accent marked him as Eastern European. Belarus, perhaps, or Western Russia. "Just to be safe, you understand." Margaret hesitated, letting uncertainty play across her features. "Well, I suppose that would be all right. Though I cannot imagine why anyone would want to hide on my little property. It is just me and my chickens out here. Gets awful lonely sometimes." The men exchanged glances. She could read their assessment in those looks. Old woman, harmless, probably going senile, exactly what she wanted them to think. Two of the contractors headed toward the barn, while Marcus and his companion began a circuit of the house. Margaret stood in the doorway, wringing her hands and making small, worried sounds that completed the picture of elderly confusion. "These men you are looking for," she called after Marcus. "They are not dangerous, are they? Should I be worried? Maybe I should call the sheriff. I have his number somewhere around here, I think." "Nothing for you to worry about, ma'am," Marcus replied without looking back. "Just some boys who owe a debt that needs paying. You just go about your business. We will be out of your hair in a few minutes." She watched them search, noted their patterns, their communication methods, the way they covered each other's blind spots. Professional, but not exceptional. They had been trained well, but they had grown complacent, overconfident. They expected to find three injured bikers hiding in obvious places, not three men concealed in a hidden cellar specifically designed to defeat this kind of search. They did not check the kitchen carefully enough, did not notice that the flour sacks against the wall had been moved recently, leaving faint marks in the dust on the floor, did not see the way Margaret's eyes tracked their movements with the predatory patience of a hawk watching mice. But something else caught her attention, something that turned the cold feeling in her stomach into ice. One of the contractors near the barn spoke briefly into a radio. She could not hear the words, but she recognized the equipment. Military-grade encrypted communications. The kind of hardware that cost more than most houses. The kind of hardware that suggested backing from someone with resources far beyond any local motorcycle club. After 20 minutes, they reconvened in her driveway. The contractors spoke in low voices while Marcus approached her one final time. "Does not look like anyone is here," he said, studying her face with renewed interest. Something in his eyes suggested doubt, instinct telling him something was not right. "But if you do see anything, anything at all, you give us a call." He pressed a business card into her hand. "Just a phone number, nothing else. Burner phone, probably untraceable." "Of course, young man. I do hope you find your friends. It is terrible to think of people being hurt out here in the wilderness. Just terrible." Marcus held her gaze for a moment longer. She could see the suspicion there, the professional's instinct that something was off. But then he shook his head, slightly dismissing the thought. Just a harmless old lady. Nothing to worry about. He turned back toward the waiting SUVs. Margaret watched them drive away. She watched until the dust settled and the sound of engines faded into the mountain silence. She watched until she was certain they were truly gone. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. She went back inside and opened the cellar. Boone was waiting at the top of the stair, his face pale but his eyes sharp. "That was one hell of an act. You had them completely fooled." "Not completely." Margaret moved past him to the window, scanning the empty driveway and the road beyond. "They will be back. Men like that always come back. The question is when and how many they will bring with them." Boone climbed the rest of the stairs, moving carefully, one hand pressed against his bandaged ribs. "Who are you really, Ma?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. The truth was something she had not spoken aloud in over 3 decades. The truth was buried beneath layers of false identities and fabricated histories locked away in classified files that supposedly no longer existed. "I was a nurse," she said, finally turning to face him. "Army Medical Corps stationed in Germany during the Cold War. That is the official story anyway. That is what is written in the records that people are allowed to see." Boone's expression said he was not buying a word of it. "Lady, I have been around dangerous people my whole life. 3 tours in Afghanistan force recon. I know what it looks like when someone has had training, real training, And you just convinced four armed killers that you were nothing but a harmless old woman, while three men they were hunting lay hidden 10 feet away. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. You moved those medical supplies like you had done it 1,000 times before. You assessed our injuries faster than most ER docs I have seen. And the way you are standing right now, scanning the road, calculating angles and sight lines. That is not a nurse. That is someone who spent their life in the field. Margaret smiled, and there was something cold in that expression. Something that made Boone step back involuntarily. Perhaps I am simply a good liar, Mr. Gallagher. Perhaps I have had a lot of practice pretending to be things I am not. The satellite phone came to life on the third attempt. She had to wait for it to acquire a signal, watching the small screen cycle through connection protocols, while her mind ran through scenarios and calculations. The number she dialed was burned into her memory, though she had never expected to use it again. It rang twice before someone answered. Langley Control, secure line. The voice was crisp, professional, utterly without warmth. It could have belonged to anyone. It could have belonged to a machine. This is Nightingale. Margaret had not spoken that name aloud in 34 years. It tasted like copper and ash on her tongue. Silence on the other end. A long, weighted pause that stretched across the miles between them. Nightingale was KIA. Budapest, November 1989. The voice had changed, become sharper, more focused. Classified Memorial. Section 60, Arlington National Cemetery. Check the grave control. Tell me who sends white roses every November 12th. More silence. She could hear typing now, fingers moving rapidly across a keyboard. Someone was pulling her file, accessing records that supposedly no longer existed. Authentication required. Confirm operational credentials. Hotel Echo Niner Niner Lima. Authorization code, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot Delta 77. Handler Director Thomas Hartwell. Operational period, January 1978 through November 1989. Do you need my blood type 2, or should I recite the Soviet order of battle for Czechoslovakia circa 1984? The typing stopped. Please hold. Hold music played softly in her ear. Some generic classical piece that she recognized from countless hours spent waiting for similar calls in decades past. Mozart, probably. Or Vivaldi, something European and refined. The kind of music that was supposed to calm agitated assets. She used the time to check on her patients. Boone had fallen into an exhausted sleep, his breathing steady. Rowan remained unconscious but stable. Dalton drifted in and out, mumbling about people who were not there. She stayed by his side, dabbing his forehead with a cool cloth, speaking softly until he settled. The young man reminded her of someone. A boy she had pulled from a shipping container in Prague decades ago. Same age, same lost expression, same desperate need to be told that the worst was over. The phone clicked. Maggie. This voice was different. Older, rougher, carrying the weight of years and secrets. Maggie Sinclair. Or is it still Roar? I can never remember which name you actually answer to these days. Director Hartwell. She felt something in her chest loosen at the sound of his voice. Thomas Hartwell had been her handler for the final 11 years of her career. The only person in the agency who had known about her growing desire to disappear. He had helped her fake her death in that warehouse fire in Budapest. He had personally overseen the creation of Margaret Sinclair, retired nurse, widow, church volunteer. He had been the last person from her old life to know she was still alive. This line is supposed to be dead, he said. You are supposed to be dead. We had a very nice memorial service. I gave a speech. Very touching, if I do say so myself. I am sure I would have cried. What happened, Maggie, she told him. About the bikers in her driveway. About the professional efficiency of the attack. About the strange coincidence that had brought 3 dying men to her remote property, 50 acres from nowhere on a road that led only to her house and nothing beyond. About the encrypted military communications she had spotted on the mercenaries. Hartwell was silent for a long moment after she finished. She could picture him, 76 now, his hair gone white, sitting in whatever office they had given him after mandatory retirement, still keeping tabs on old operations, still watching the ghosts. Maggie listened to me carefully. His voice had changed. Become urgent. There have been rumors lately, questions being asked about old operations. Someone has been digging through archived files looking for connections to missions that were supposed to have been erased decades ago. The words hit her like a physical blow. That is impossible. Those files were burned. I watched them burn. Physical files, yes. But memories have a way of surfacing when the right pressure is applied. Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. What kind of pressure? 3 months ago, Viktor Dragunov was released from a Russian prison. The name struck her like ice water. Prague, 1984. She could still see his face twisted with rage as the Czech authorities dragged him away. Could still hear his voice screaming promises of vengeance that had echoed through the years like a curse that refused to die. That is impossible. He was sentenced to life. The charges I built should have kept him locked away forever. The Soviet Union fell, Maggie. The Czech Republic joined NATO. Old alliances shifted. Old debts were called in. Dragunov had friends, people who owed him favors from before his imprisonment. He has been very busy since his release, paying for information, following paper trails. Hartwell paused. She could hear him breathing. The slight wheeze that suggested his lungs were not what they used to be. Too many years of filterless cigarettes and recycled air in classified facilities. Apparently, he connected Elena Rohr to a warehouse fire in Budapest and started asking why there was no body, why the memorial had no remains, why a woman who supposedly died in 1989 had property records in Montana starting in 2009. How long do I have if he sent those bikers to draw you out? He already knows where you are. When they do not report back, he will send more. Or he will come himself. Margaret stood at the window, the phone pressed to her ear, watching the empty driveway and the road beyond. The mountains stood silent and indifferent, the way they had stood for millions of years before her and would stand for millions of years after. Maggie, you need to disappear tonight. I can have an extraction team to you within 6 hours. New identity, new location, enough money to start over. No, this is suicide. You are 73 years old. These are not street thugs playing at being tough. Dragunov will send professionals, killers with training and resources, and I said no. The word came out harder than she intended. She softened her voice but not her resolve. This is my home, Thomas. I have been running for 34 years. I am tired of running. I am tired of looking over my shoulder. And I am done letting men like Viktor Dragunov decide how and when I die. Maggie. Goodbye, Thomas. She ended the call and slipped the phone into her pocket. Boone was standing in the hallway. She did not know how long he had been listening, but the expression on his face suggested it had been long enough. The silence between them stretched thin as wire. Then Boone spoke. Prague, 1984. Who is Viktor Dragunov? Margaret looked at this man, this stranger who had stumbled into her life through violence and circumstance. 3 broken ribs, a concussion, dried blood still crusted in his hair. Standing in her hallway asking questions he had every right to ask. She could have lied, could have deflected, changed the subject, maintained the fiction of the harmless widow, but something in Boone's eyes stopped her. He had earned the truth. They all had. Sit down, she said. This is going to take a while. They moved to the kitchen. She brewed fresh coffee, the familiar routine steadying her hands, giving her something to do while she excavated memories she had buried for decades. She told him about Elena Rohr, the Irish girl from Boston, who joined the army at 18 with nothing but a high school diploma and a desperate need to escape a father who drank and a mother who looked the other way. Told him about nursing school at Fort Sam Houston, about the recruiter from the CIA who had approached her in her 3rd year with an offer that seemed too good to be true. They wanted someone who could blend in, she said, her voice distant with memory, someone who could pass for European, someone with medical training who could handle themselves in the field, someone young enough to be moldable, old enough to understand what they were being asked to do. The training had come next. The farm, they called it, Camp Perry, Virginia, though that name appeared on no official maps. 6 months of learning how to lie, how to steal, how to kill if necessary, how to become someone else so completely that you forgot who you had been before. They taught us to compartmentalize, she continued, to separate who we were from what we did, to build walls inside our own minds so thick that even we could not see past them. I was good at it, too good. By the time I finished training, Elena Rohr was already fading, becoming a memory, becoming someone I used to be. She told him about her first assignment. West Berlin, 1978. working as a nurse in a civilian hospital while running assets across the wall, passing information, coordinating defections, building networks that existed only in encrypted cables and dead drops in the Tiergarten. For 6 years, she lived two lives simultaneously. The nurse who treated patients with gentle hands and a warm smile. The operative who slipped through checkpoints with forged documents and a steady pulse. Neither life felt entirely real. Both felt entirely necessary. And then she told him about Prague. His name was Viktor Dragunov, she said. And even now, 40 years later, the name tasted like ash. KGB colonel. Officially attached to their embassy as a cultural liaison. Unofficially, he ran one of the most lucrative smuggling operations in Eastern Europe. She paused, staring into her coffee, as if the dark liquid held answers she had been searching for since 1984. Not drugs, not weapons, children. Boone's jaw tightened. She described it all. The intelligence that had come across her desk. The photographs that had made her sick to her stomach. Dozens of children trafficked from orphanages across the Soviet bloc. Sold to buyers in the West who paid in hard currency and asked no questions. The mission parameters were clear. She continued, her voice hardening. Terminate Dragunov. Make it look like an accident or a robbery gone wrong. Avoid international incidents that could complicate ongoing negotiations between Washington and Moscow. Clean, quiet, professional. But when I got there, when I saw what he was doing, she stopped, the words catching in her throat. Even after all these years, the memory had power. There were 52 children in those containers. The youngest was 3 years old. 3. And they were being loaded onto trucks like cargo, like furniture being moved from one warehouse to another. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she was back there. The smell of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies. The sound of a child crying softly in the darkness, a sound so small it might have been the wind. The industrial fluorescence turning everything the color of a bruise. She had opened the first container, expecting to find weapons. What she found instead had broken something inside her that never fully healed. 52 faces staring back at her, some crying, some silent, already learning at 3 and 4 and 5 years old that crying brought punishment. Some too thin, some with bruises, all of them looking at her with the same expression. Not hope. They were too young and too damaged for hope. Just waiting. Waiting for whatever would happen next, the way animals wait in a cage. She had made a decision then. A decision that had defined the rest of her life. I did not just spar Dragunov. I burned his entire operation to the ground. 3 weeks of midnight raids. Freeing children, destroying records. Tracking down every subsidiary operation and leaving nothing but ash. And when I finally had him cornered in his office, overlooking the Vltava River, I did not put a bullet in his head the way my orders demanded. What did you do? I handed him over to the Czech authorities, with enough evidence to ensure he would never see freedom again. Bank records, photographs, testimony from victims who were old enough to speak. Everything I had gathered, all of it documented and notarized and impossible to ignore. She could still see his face as they dragged him away. Still hear his voice screaming in Russian, in Czech, in broken English, fighting against the hands that held him. He swore he would find me, she whispered. Screamed it until they threw him in the van. I will find you, Nightingale. I will spend my life finding you. And when I do, I will make you watch everyone you love die before I let you join them. Boone was silent for a long moment, processing. Nightingale, that was your code name. Yes, and you thought a life sentence would be enough, that he would die behind bars. I was young, I believed in justice. I thought the world worked the way they taught us in training, where the good guys win and the bad guys stay locked up forever. She turned away from him, suddenly exhausted. I was wrong about a lot of things. How did he find you? Someone talked. Someone always talks. The Cold War ended. Old alliances shifted, and information that was supposed to stay buried found its way to people willing to pay for it. Dragunov had 35 years to build networks, to call in favors, to piece together the puzzle of what happened to the woman who destroyed his life. She pulled the satellite phone from her pocket, stared at it for a moment, then set it on the table. My old handler confirmed it this morning. Dragunov was released from prison 3 months ago, and he has been very busy since then. Boone's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, wincing as his broken ribs protested the movement. The serpents. This whole thing with us refusing to run drugs for them. It was not just about that, was it? Margaret met his eyes. Think about it. Your club says no to moving product. The serpents retaliate by beating you half to death. But they do not just leave you on the side of the road. They leave you here, on my property. On a road that leads nowhere except to my front door. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Slowly at first, then all at once. We were bait, you were bait, and I took it. The moment I started treating your wounds, the moment I brought you inside instead of calling an ambulance, I confirmed to whoever was watching that I am not just some harmless old woman, that I have skills I should not have, knowledge I should not possess. A sound from the living room. Rowan had climbed off his mattress during this exchange, moving quietly despite his injuries. Now he stood in the doorway, his broken arm cradled against his chest, his face grim. So we are all dead, he said flatly. You, us, anyone who gets in this guy's way. Not if we are smart, not if we fight. Fight, Rowan's laugh was bitter. Lady, I do not know what kind of operator you were back in the day, but look at us. Boone has 3 broken ribs and a concussion. I have a compound fracture and internal bleeding. Smoke can barely walk. And you are 73 years old. What exactly are we supposed to fight with? Margaret walked to the kitchen, reached behind the flour sacks, and pulled out the Glock. She set it on the table with a soft click that seemed to echo in the quiet room. With everything we have, with terrain advantage and defensive preparation, with the fact that Dragunov expects me to run, to disappear into whatever hole I have been hiding in for the past 3 decades. He does not expect me to stand and fight. And he certainly does not expect me to have help. She looked at each of them in turn. 3 strangers who had stumbled into her life through violence and circumstance. 3 men who owed her nothing and had every reason to disappear into the mountains and pretend none of this had ever happened. I am not asking you to stay, she said quietly. This is not your fight. You can leave. Take the truck in the barn drive until you hit the highway and never look back. No one would blame you. Boone and Rowan exchanged glances. Some silent communication passed between them. The kind of wordless understanding that came from years of riding together, of being brothers in more than just name. We owe you our lives, Boone said simply. You could have left us in your driveway, could have called an ambulance and washed your hands of it, could have driven away the moment you saw what kind of trouble we would bring to your door. Where I come from, Rowan added, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. That means something. You save a man's life, you are responsible for it. That cuts both ways. From the living room came a weak voice. Dalton had managed to sit up, his young face pale and drawn, but his eyes clear for the first time since they had arrived. I do not know much about fighting. Never been in the military, never been in a war. But I know what it feels like when someone stands up for you. When someone puts themselves between you and the people trying to hurt you. He met Margaret's eyes with surprising directness. My whole life, people looked the other way. Teachers who saw the bruises, neighbors who heard the screaming. Nobody did anything. Nobody stepped up. Until Boone found me in that alley in Billings and gave me a chance. Gave me a family. He struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. You did the same thing for us yesterday. So yeah, maybe I am scared. Maybe I do not know what I am doing. But I am not leaving. Whatever happens, I am staying. Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. 40 years. 40 years of running and hiding and pretending to be someone she was not. 40 years of believing that the price of her choices was eternal isolation. That she would die alone. That everyone she had ever saved would move on with their lives while she remained frozen in amber, a ghost haunting her own existence. And now, at the end of everything, she had found something she had stopped believing in long ago. A family. All right, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. If you are staying, we do this my way. I have spent 30 years learning how to survive situations exactly like this one. If you want to live through what is coming, you follow my instructions. Exactly. No questions, no hesitation. Understood. 3 nods. 3 men who had no idea what they were agreeing to, but would learn. Good. Then let us get to work. The rest of the night passed in preparation that felt like a ritual. Margaret moved through her property with the economy of motion that came from decades of doing exactly this kind of work. She showed them the barn first, not the barn they had seen with its cobwebs and rusted tools and dust thick as carpet. The other barn, the one that existed behind the false wall that Edward had built during their first summer together back when he still thought he was helping his wife prepare for nothing more than a Montana winter. Hidden compartments lined the walls, each one sealed with the same biometric locks that protected the steel case, each one containing supplies she had accumulated over 15 years of quiet, systematic preparation for a day she had prayed would never come. Weapons. 3 rifles, each cleaned and maintained with the same obsessive care she gave the Glock. Ammunition stored in waterproof containers sorted by caliber and purpose. Body armor that was outdated by military standards, but would still stop most handgun rounds. Communications equipment that could reach any satellite in orbit. Night vision optics, tripwire, flares, and medical supplies, enough to run a small field hospital. Because Margaret Sinclair, whatever else she might have been, had never stopped being a nurse. Boone moved through the cache with the practiced eye of a man who understood what he was looking at. His force recon training was evident in the way he handled each weapon, checking the action, testing the sight, committing the weight and balance to memory. "You have been preparing for this for a long time," he said quietly. "I have been preparing for this every day since I faked my death in 1989. Every single day, updating escape routes, maintaining equipment, running scenarios in my head while I planted lavender and baked pies for church socials." She paused, looking around at the arsenal she had built over the years. "This is what paranoia looks like when you give it 15 years in a hardware store." She taught them the basics of tactical thinking, how to use terrain, how to create choke points that would force an enemy to come at them on their terms rather than theirs, how to position defenders so that overlapping fields of fire could compensate for inferior numbers. Boone absorbed it all quickly. His military training gave him a framework to build on. Rowan was slower but methodical, asking questions with his one good hand, making sure he understood before moving on. Dalton struggled, his concussion making concentration difficult, but he persevered, his youth and determination compensating for his lack of experience. Margaret watched the young man fumble with a rifle magazine and felt something twist in her chest. He was so young, they were all so young compared to the weight of what was coming. But young did not mean weak. She had learned that lesson in Prague, watching children younger than Dalton show more courage than men 3 times their age. As dawn approached, Margaret stood on her porch one last time. The Bitterroot Mountains rose against the lightning sky like sentinels, their peaks dusted with the first snow of the season. The air smelled of pine and frost and something else, something electric and charged like the atmosphere before a storm. Behind her, 3 men slept in shifts. Wounded, exhausted, and committed to a fight they did not fully understand against an enemy they had never met. They had chosen to stay. Chosen to stand beside a 73-year-old woman whose real name they did not even know. Chosen family over safety. Margaret sipped her coffee. Black, no sugar, the way she had always taken it. Somewhere out there beyond the mountains and the silence and the vast indifference of the Montana wilderness, Viktor Dragunov was coming. After 40 years of patience and rage and promises whispered in a prison cell, he was finally coming to collect. Let him come, she thought. Let them all come. She was done running. The sound of motorcycle engines broke the morning quiet. Not the deep rumble of Harleys this time, but something different. Multiple bikes approaching fast from the south. Margaret moved to the window, her hand instinctively reaching for the Glock at her hip. 7 motorcycles crested the hill, riding in tight formation. All of them bore the Iron Wolves patch. All of them carried men who moved with the confidence of warriors heading into battle. The lead rider dismounted first. He was older than the others, maybe 55, with iron gray hair and shoulders that looked like they could support the weight of the world. His vest identified him as president. The patch above his heart read Ironside. Boone met him at the door. The 2 men embraced with the fierce intensity of brothers who had been through fire together. "Got your message," Ironside said, his voice like gravel being crushed. "Took me a while to round up the boys who could ride. Some of them are old like me. Some of them got families to think about. But we came, all of us, because that is what brothers do." His name was Sullivan Briggs, and he had earned that name, Ironside, the hard way. 3 tours with SEAL Team 6, more deployments than he cared to count. Buried friends in Arlington and small-town cemeteries from California to Maine. The kind of man who measured his life not in years but in missions accomplished and brothers lost. He looked past Boone to where Margaret stood watching from the doorway. His eyes narrowed, assessing, calculating. Whatever he saw made him nod slowly. You are the one who saved their lives. I did what anyone would do. No. Sullivan's voice carried absolute certainty. Most people would have called 911 and washed their hands of it. You brought them inside, protected them, kept them alive when men came looking to finish the job. That means something in our world. That means everything. He turned back to his men, 7 riders standing in a loose semicircle on her gravel driveway. Some young, some old. Some carrying the scars of combat, others carrying the scars of lives lived hard and without apology. Boys, this here is Maggie Sinclair. From this moment forward, she is under Iron Wolf's protection. Anyone wants to hurt her, they go through us first. Anyone wants to thank her for saving Boone, Rowan, and Smoke, they do it by standing with us when the hammer comes down. Are we clear? 7 voices answered as one. Clear. Margaret felt her throat tighten. She had commanded operations involving hundreds of personnel. She had coordinated strikes that changed the course of international relations. But this simple declaration of loyalty from men she had known for less than 48 hours touched something deep inside her that she had thought had died years ago. Thank you, she managed. But you need to understand what you are getting into. The man coming for me is not some local thug. He is a professional. Former KGB, current Russian intelligence asset. He has at least 15 trained killers at his disposal. Men who have seen combat, who know how to operate under fire. Coming here might be the last thing you ever do. Sullivan's smile held no humor but plenty of steel. Ma'am, I did 3 tours with SEAL Team 6. Lost more brothers than I care to count. Every man here has seen the elephant. We know what we are signing up for. He stepped closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. But here is what you need to understand. We are not doing this because we are brave or stupid or looking for a fight. We are doing this because Boone sent out a distress call, because 3 of our brothers were dying and you saved them when you could have walked away. Because in the Iron Wolves, we do not leave family behind. And you became family the moment you decided to stand instead of run. The next hours passed in a blur of preparation. Sullivan brought more than just men. He brought weapons, ammunition, body armor, communications equipment. Supplies that turned Margaret's modest ranch from a vulnerable target into something resembling a defensive position. The 10 bikers worked alongside Margaret with focus that surprised her. They established overlapping fields of fire, created fallback positions, identified the choke points where superior numbers could be neutralized by terrain and tactics. Sullivan had clearly done this before, his experience evident in every decision he made. Margaret found herself working alongside men half her age, keeping pace despite joints that protested and muscles that ached. She showed them the hidden paths through the woods behind her property, the blind spots in the terrain, the places where an attacker would be forced to expose themselves. Knowledge accumulated over 15 years of paranoid preparation finally being put to use. By mid-morning, she had learned each man's name and capability. There was Briggs, the youngest of the group, at 26, quick with his hands and quicker with a rifle. Orgrar, the oldest after Sullivan, a Vietnam-era Marine who had forgotten more about warfare than most people ever learned. Pike, who had served 2 tours in Iraq and still walked with a limp from an IED that took his left foot below the ankle. Webb, quiet and intense, who never spoke about his past but handled explosives with the familiarity of an old friend. And there was Holt. Margaret noticed him early, 28 thin with restless eyes that never quite settled. He laughed too easily and talked too much, filling silences with chatter that served no purpose except to mask his nervousness. His hands were steady when they needed to be, but when he thought no one was watching, they trembled. She filed the observation away. Old habits. During a break from the physical labor, Dalton sat beside her on the porch steps. The young man's concussion had improved enough that he could walk without swaying, though the headaches still came in waves. He held a mug of coffee in both hands, staring at the steam, as if it contained answers. Can I ask you something, Mrs. Sinclair? Of course. When you found those kids in Prague, the 52 children, were you scared? Margaret considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Dalton was not asking for reassurance. He was asking because he was terrified and needed to know that terror was not weakness. I was so scared I could barely breathe, she said honestly. My hands were shaking. My heart was beating so hard I was certain the guards could hear it. And when I opened that first container and saw those faces staring back at me, I wanted to run. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to close the door and pretend I had never seen what was inside. But you did not run. No, because I realized something in that moment, something I have carried with me ever since. Fear is not the opposite of courage. Fear is the prerequisite. You cannot be brave without first being afraid. The only question that matters is what you do with the fear, whether you let it stop you or whether you use it as fuel to do what needs to be done. Dalton was quiet for a long time. Then he said I was afraid when Boone found me in that alley, afraid he was going to hurt me like everyone else. But he just sat down next to me and offered me half a sandwich. Did not say anything for a long time. Just sat there. And for the first time in my life, I felt like someone actually saw me. Margaret heard the echo of 52 children staring at her from inside a shipping container. The same expression, not hope, just the raw, overwhelming relief of being seen. Dalton, she said gently, whatever happens tonight, I want you to know something. You are braver than you think. The boy who survived what you survived, who kept going when every reason to stop was right in front of him, that boy has more courage than most soldiers I have served with. Do not ever let anyone tell you different. He did not answer, but she saw his shoulders straighten slightly, saw the fear in his eyes recede just a fraction, replaced by something harder and more durable. Resolve. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they gathered in the barn for a final briefing. Margaret had spread a hand-drawn map of the property across an old workbench, marking positions and approaches with careful precision. They will come at night, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had planned and executed more operations than most of these men had years. Probably around 0300, dark enough to move unseen. Late enough that they think we will be sleeping. They will approach from multiple directions, trying to divide our attention. Overwhelm us with superior numbers. How do you know that, one of the younger bikers asked? Because that is what I would do. That is what any competent tactical commander would do. Boone leaned over the map, studying it with a professional eye. We cannot defend every approach. We do not have the numbers. We do not need to defend everywhere. We just need to make them come at us where we want them. Force them into kill zones where their numbers become a liability rather than an advantage. She pointed to 3 spots on the map. Here, here, and here, these are natural choke points. Narrow approaches with limited visibility and no cover. We put our best shooters in elevated positions with clear sight lines. We rig trip wires and noisemakers to alert us when they are coming. And we make every shot count. Rowan spoke up, his voice thoughtful, despite the pain medication dulling his eyes. What about the house itself? If they get past the outer defenses, we fall back to the cellar. It is reinforced, has its own air supply and only one entrance that can be defended by a single person. If it comes to that, we hold there until the FBI arrives. Sullivan absorbed this, his tactical mind clearly working through scenarios. And if Dragunov does not wait until tonight, if he decides to hit us now in daylight with overwhelming force, then we fight with what we have and hope it is enough. The satellite phone buzzed. Margaret answered it, moving away from the group for privacy. It is Judith. The voice belonged to Judith Pemberton, 68 years old, former CIA analyst, and one of the few people alive who knew that Margaret Sinclair and Elena Rohr were the same person. She had been Margaret's analyst during the Prague operation. The person who had fed her intelligence, provided backup, made sure she had what she needed when she needed it. I have what you asked for, Judith said without preamble. And Maggie, it is worse than we thought. Margaret carried the phone to the group. Tell me. Viktor Dragunov did not just get out of prison. He walked out with a full pardon from the Russian government. Someone very high up wanted him free, and they were willing to spend considerable political capital to make it happen. What? Because Dragunov spent 35 years in prison building something, a network. Contacts with every major organized crime syndicate in Eastern Europe. The kind of connections that are worth their weight in gold to certain people in Moscow who need deniable assets for operations that cannot be traced back to the Kremlin. Boone's jaw tightened. You are saying he is working for Russian intelligence now? Not officially, but he has their protection, their resources, and their implicit approval to handle certain problems they would rather not deal with directly. One of those problems is an old CIA operative who made him look like a fool and cost the KGB a significant asset. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was not just about revenge anymore. This was about making an example, showing the world what happened to people who crossed Russian intelligence even decades later. What is his current position? He is operating out of a compound 60 miles north of your location. Former hunting lodge purchased through a shell corporation 3 weeks ago. The place is fortified. Satellite imagery shows at least 15 men on site, all military age, all moving with professional discipline. My best guess is former Spetsnaz or Wagner group. There is more. The serpents who beat up your friends are not just some local motorcycle club. They have been on a DEA watch list for 2 years. Drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, money laundering. But here is the interesting part. 3 months ago, their financial situation changed dramatically. Someone started feeding them serious money, enough to buy new bikes, new weapons, and enough product to expand their territory significantly. Dragunov, Margaret said quietly. That is my guess. He bought himself a local crew to do his dirty work. Keep things at arm's length. And when your friends here refused to play ball with the serpents, he saw an opportunity to flush you out. The pieces were falling into place. A picture both elegant and terrifying in its simplicity. Dragunov had been planning this for months, positioning his assets, building his network, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Judith, I need one more thing. Name it. Contact Thomas Hartwell. Tell him I need satellite coverage of this area for the next 72 hours. Real-time monitoring. And I need him to have an FBI rapid response team on standby. Not for extraction, for cleanup. Maggie, what are you planning? I am planning to end this, one way or another. She ended the call. When she looked up, all eyes were on her. Some held fear, some held determination. All held the understanding that what was coming would test every one of them. You are actually going to fight them, Dalton said from the doorway. It was not a question. We are going to fight them, Margaret replied. All of us, together. Sullivan studied the map one final time, committing every position to memory. He traced the approaches with a thick finger, paused at each choke point, visualized the engagement from the attacker's perspective. Then he looked up at Margaret with something she had not seen in a man's eyes in a very long time. Professional respect, the kind of respect that could only come from one warrior recognizing another. You know what you are doing, he said. This is not your first time planning a defense. No, it is not. Then I will defer to your judgment on positioning. My boys will follow your lead. He said it simply, without ego or reservation. The mark of a true leader. Someone who understood that rank mattered less than competence and that the best person to lead was whoever knew the terrain. The satellite phone buzzed, one more time. Thomas Hartwell. I have arranged for satellite coverage, he said. Real-time thermal imaging. Communications intercepts. The works. And I have an FBI hostage rescue team staged at Malmstrom Air Force Base. They can be wheels up in 15 minutes if you need them. Thank you, Thomas. His voice softened. Maggie, if you die out there, it is going to devastate a lot of people who still remember Nightingale, who still remember what you accomplished, the lives you saved, the operations you ran. You were one of the best we ever had. Were is the operative word. I am not that person anymore. Have not been for a long time. Maybe not. But the woman who brought 3 dying strangers into her home and chose to fight rather than run, that woman reminds me very much of the operative I used to know. The one who destroyed an entire KGB network to save 52 children. The one who always chose to do what was right instead of what was safe. Margaret closed her eyes. She could hear Edward's voice in her memory overlapping with Hartwell's. You cannot save everyone, Maggie. But that does not mean you stop trying. Do you still believe in the good guys, Thomas? I believe in you. That has always been enough. She ended the call and slipped the phone into her pocket. Through the barn window, she could see the last light fading from the western sky. The mountains had become silhouettes. The world was narrowing to shadow and starlight and the cold certainty of what was coming. Night fell over Montana like a curtain dropping across a stage. The temperature plummeted. Frost formed on windows and turned breath into visible clouds. Margaret moved through the house one final time, checking positions, making sure everyone knew their roles. The house itself was dark, windows covered, only red-filtered flashlights providing minimal illumination. Every man in position, every weapon loaded, every nerve drawn tight as piano wire. Boone had taken position in the barn loft with a scoped hunting rifle. His military training made him their best long-range shooter. Rowan, despite his broken arm, held down the house's main entrance with a shotgun and grim determination. Dalton stayed close to Margaret, learning, watching, trying to absorb decades of experience in a matter of hours. The 7 iron wolves spread out across the property, each man in a carefully selected position that maximized their effectiveness while minimizing their exposure. Sullivan coordinated everything from the barn, his combat experience evident in every decision he made, even with one arm in a makeshift sling from an old injury that flared in the cold. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Midnight came and went. 1 o'clock passed in tense silence. Then 2. Margaret moved between positions, checking on her defenders, making small adjustments. She pressed coffee into cold hands, checked ammunition counts, offered quiet words that were not quite encouragement and not quite comfort. Just the simple acknowledgement that they were here together and that mattered. It was during this final circuit that Margaret noticed it, a shadow moving where no shadow should be, near the eastern tree line just beyond the perimeter they had established. Quick and furtive, keeping low, moving with purpose toward the road. She watched through the night vision optics and felt something sink in her chest. Holt. The young biker moved quickly through the trees, a cell phone pressed to his ear. His free hand gestured as he spoke, the movements urgent, frantic. She could not hear the words from this distance, but she did not need to. The picture was clear enough. She moved silently through the darkness, covering ground with a speed that belied her age. Decades of fieldwork had taught her how to move without sound, how to close distance on a target without alerting them. Holt never heard her coming. She was 3 feet behind him when she spoke. "Put the phone down, Holt." He spun, his face white in the moonlight. The phone dropped from his fingers, hitting the soft pine needles with a muffled thud. "Mrs. Sinclair, I was just—" "Do not lie to me, son. I have been watching liars for 40 years. I can see it in the way you hold your shoulders, in the way your eyes move, in the way your hands have been shaking since you arrived. Who were you talking to?" The silence stretched between them. Margaret could see the calculations running behind his eyes. Fight or flight. Deny or confess. She had seen that look on the faces of dozens of assets over the years. The moment when a person realized they had been caught and had to decide what came next. "Please," Holt whispered. "You do not understand. I owe them money. A lot of money. Gambling debts. The Serpents bought my markers 3 months ago. They said all I had to do was make one phone call when the time came. Tell them where everyone was positioned. They said nobody had to get hurt." Margaret felt anger rise in her chest, hot and immediate. But she did not let it reach her face. She had learned long ago that anger was a luxury an operative could not afford. Instead, she kept her voice level, almost gentle. "What did you tell them?" Holt's face crumbled. "Everything. The positions, the weapons, where you put the tripwires, where Boone is set up with the rifle. All of it. They said if I did not tell them, they would find my sister in Bozeman. She has 2 kids. She does not even know I am part of the club." Margaret studied him for a long moment. She could see the fear. Real, genuine, bone-deep fear. Not for himself, for his sister, for 2 children in Bozeman who would never know how close they had come to being used as leverage in a game they did not know was being played. "I understand fear," she said quietly. "I have spent most of my life afraid. But fear is only useful if it teaches you something. What did it teach you tonight that I made a mistake? That I should have come to you first instead of trying to handle it alone?" She picked up the phone from the ground, looked at the call log. The number matched the burner phone Marcus Ledford had given her. The Serpents, Dragunov's local proxies. "Here is what is going to happen." Margaret said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You are going to tell me exactly what they know. Every detail, every question they asked, and every answer you gave. And then you are going to help me fix this. Fix it. How? By giving them what they expect." She held up the phone. "They think they know where we are positioned. So we reposition. Every man, every weapon, every tripwire. We move everything in the next 2 hours and turn their intelligence into a trap. But they will know something is wrong if I stop answering. Then you keep answering. You tell them exactly what they want to hear. You confirm positions that no longer exist. You describe defenses that we have already moved. You become the best liar you have ever been, because if you are not, people die, starting with us, and then possibly your sister. Holt stared at her, his young face pale and drawn in the moonlight. Then he nodded. Tell me what to say. Margaret brought him back to the barn. She told Sullivan and Boone in private. Sullivan's first instinct was violence, his massive hands curling into fists that could have broken Holt in half. But Margaret stopped him with a look. We need him. His information is compromised, but his phone is our greatest asset right now. If we play this right, Dragunov's men will walk into a killing field of our design, not his. Sullivan stared at her for a long moment, the muscles in his jaw working as he processed this. Then the SEAL training took over the tactical mind, overriding the emotional one. You are right, but when this is over, he and I are going to have a conversation. They worked through the deepest hours of the night, silently, efficiently, moving every position 30 to 50 yards from where Holt had reported them, repositioning tripwires, adjusting fields of fire, creating new choke points that would channel Dragunov's men into ambush positions they could not see coming. Every 30 minutes, Holt sent a text on the burner phone. Confirmed positions, described defensive measures that had already been dismantled on, reported that Margaret was sleeping in the main house, unguarded, vulnerable. Each message was dictated by Margaret herself, crafted with the precision of someone who had spent decades constructing exactly this kind of disinformation. By 2 in the morning, the transformation was complete. Every defensive position had been relocated, every trap reset. The property that Dragunov's men thought they understood was now something entirely different, a machine designed for one purpose. Margaret stood in the darkness of the barn loft, looking out over her property. The mountains were invisible, just a deeper shade of black against the star-filled sky. The air was bitter cold, the kind of cold that seeped through clothing and settled into bones. Beside her, Boone checked his rifle one final time. His breathing was steady, controlled. The breathing of a man who had learned long ago how to manage fear. You know, he said quietly, when I found Dalton in that alley in Billings 3 years ago, he was 17, living in a cardboard box behind a pawn shop, bruises all over his face, would not look anyone in the eye. I almost walked past him. What stopped you? I saw his hands. They were shaking, not from cold, from trying not to cry. And I thought about every time someone walked past me when I needed help and kept walking. Every time I was the kid nobody stopped for. He adjusted the rifle scope with precise movements. That is why I am here, Mrs. Sinclair, not because of some code or honor or brotherhood, because you stopped. When every logical part of your brain must have been screaming to walk away, you stopped and you helped 3 strangers who were bleeding in your driveway. You stopped. Same as I stopped for Dalton. Margaret said nothing for a long moment. Then she placed her hand briefly on his arm. My name is not really Margaret, she said softly. It is Elena. Elena Rohr. I have not told anyone that in 34 years. Boone looked at her, his face barely visible in the starlight. Thank you for trusting me with that. Thank you for staying. The radio crackled softly at 0245. Sullivan's voice barely a whisper. Movement on the North Road. Multiple vehicles. Lights off. Approaching slow. Margaret keyed her own mic. Everyone hold position. Let them come to us. Wait for my signal. She moved to the edge of the loft and watched the darkness resolve into shapes. 5 SUVs moving in tactical formation, engines running quiet. They stopped a quarter-mile out, just beyond effective range of anything but Boone's rifle. Doors opened. Men emerged. Even in the darkness, she could see the professional way they moved. Low crouches, weapons ready, communication through hand signals rather than voice. These were not thugs or amateurs. These were soldiers. They moved toward the positions Holt had reported. Confident, certain, expecting to find defenders exactly where their intelligence said they would be. They found nothing. She could see the confusion ripple through them. Team leaders checking coordinates. Men sweeping empty positions with thermal optics. The careful plan unraveling in real time as they realized their intelligence was worthless. Margaret keyed her radio. Now. The night exploded. Boone's rifle spoke first from the barn loft. One shot, one body dropping, second shot, another man down. The attackers scattered, but they scattered toward the positions they assumed were empty. The positions where Sullivan's men were waiting. Tripwires ignited flares, turning night into artificial day. In the sudden white light, the attackers were exposed, silhouetted, vulnerable. The Iron Wolves opened fire from positions that should not have existed, from angles that the enemy's intelligence had not predicted, from elevations that turned the carefully planned assault into a killing field. The first wave crumbled within 30 seconds. 6 men down, dead or dying, bleeding into Montana soil. Margaret watched from her position near the house, coordinating movements over the radio with a calm that belonged to another era, another woman. She could see the confusion spreading through the attackers. Men trained to execute a precise plan, suddenly discovering that the plan was built on lies. Some froze, some scattered, some tried to improvise new positions, but improvisation requires time, and time was something Margaret had no intention of giving them. Orwell, the Vietnam-era Marine, held the western flank with the patience of a man who had spent months in jungle ambushes. He did not fire until the targets were within 30 yards. When he did fire, he did not miss. 3 rounds, 3 men. Each shot placed with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that ammunition was precious and every round had to earn its keep. The second wave came at 03:15. These men had learned from the first group's failure. They used smoke grenades, suppressive fire, proper tactical movement. They abandoned the compromised intelligence and relied on training and instinct instead. They were better, much better. They came from the east using the natural terrain to mask their approach. Trees and boulders provided cover that the northern approach had lacked. These men moved in pairs, leapfrogging forward, one team providing covering fire while the other advanced. Standard infantry tactics executed with the smooth efficiency of men who had done this dozens of times before. Dalton spotted them through the thermal optics Margaret had pulled from her hidden cache. East side, 9 contacts, moving in pairs. The Iron Wolves shifted positions, adapted, responded. These were not trained soldiers in the conventional sense, but they were experienced fighters who had learned tactics through hard necessity and street warfare. More importantly, they were defending home ground, fighting for family, and that made them dangerous in ways no amount of military training could match. The firefight that followed was savage, precise, personal. These men knew how to fight, and they fought with the desperate intensity of professionals who understood that retreat meant failure, and failure meant death. Bullets punched through wood and ricocheted off stone. The smell of cordite filled the air, acrid and burning. Margaret heard the distinctive crack of rounds passing close, the sound that separated the living from the dead by inches and milliseconds. She returned fire with controlled bursts, placing each shot with the care of someone who knew exactly how many rounds she had left. Dalton stayed low beside her, feeding her information from the thermal optics. His voice was shaking, but his observations were accurate. He was learning combat the way she had learned it decades ago. Not from manuals or training exercises, but from the immediate and unforgiving reality of people trying to kill him. 3 moving along the tree line, he reported. 200 yards. They are trying to flank the barn. Margaret relayed the information to Sullivan, who redirected Pike and Briggs to intercept. The flanking team walked into a crossfire that lasted 4 seconds and left all 3 of them on the ground. It was during the 3rd minute of this engagement that Webb fell. He was holding the southern choke point, the position Margaret had identified as the most critical. The one where a single defender could hold back a dozen attackers if they held their nerve and their aim. Webb held both. He held them with the quiet ferocity of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of moment. The bullet took him through the chest. A clean shot from a marksman who knew his craft. Webb did not fall immediately. He fired 3 more rounds, each one finding its mark before his legs gave way beneath him. He slid down the wall of the stone barrier he had been using as cover, leaving a dark smear on the pale rock. Pike was closest. He dragged Webb behind cover, pressing his hands against the wound, but even in the darkness they both knew. Some wounds cannot be repaired by pressure and prayer. "Tell my wife," Webb whispered. Then nothing. Margaret heard the report over the radio and felt the words land like stones in her chest. She had known loss, had carried it for decades. But it never got lighter. The weight of a man's death never diminished with repetition. It only accumulated, building upon the losses that came before until the burden became almost too heavy to bear. She filed the grief away in the place where she stored such things and kept fighting. The Eastern assault broke at the 7-minute mark. 6 more of Dragunov's men lay scattered across the field. 3 had retreated wounded, dragging their injured back into the darkness. But the cost had been real. Webb was dead. Sullivan had taken a round through his left shoulder while shielding Dalton from a flanking maneuver. 2 other bikers carried wounds that would need attention before dawn. Sullivan sat against the barn wall, his face gray with pain, while Margaret worked on his shoulder with steady hands. The bullet had passed through clean, missing the bone, but the blood loss was significant. "You need to stay down," she told him, her voice brooking no argument. "You have lost too much blood to be effective in a fight." Sullivan grabbed her wrist with his good hand. His grip was still strong despite the wound. The iron in his eyes had not dimmed. "Worth it," he said through gritted teeth. "Every drop. That is what protecting family looks like." Margaret met his eyes and saw something she recognized. The same look Edward had given her in those final hours. Not surrender, not defeat, just the calm acceptance of a man who understood the cost of the choices he had made and would make them again without hesitation. She finished bandaging his shoulder and moved on. By 0345, the attacking force had been cut nearly in half. 12 men down. The surviving contractors had pulled back to regroup, their confidence shattered by resistance they had never anticipated. The intelligence that was supposed to give them an overwhelming advantage had become a trap. The old woman who was supposed to be an easy target had turned their assault into a massacre. But Margaret knew it was not over, because Dragunov himself had not shown. He was waiting, watching, learning from his men's failures. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the reach of their night vision optics, he was preparing to make his move. The radio crackled with a voice she had not heard in 40 years, but recognized instantly. "Nightingale, I know you can hear me." Margaret picked up the radio. Her finger hovered over the transmit button. Around her, the house held its breath. Men who had bet their lives that she was worth protecting, that standing against overwhelming odds was better than walking away, that some things mattered more than survival. She pressed the button. "Hello, Victor. It has been a long time." The response came immediately, sharp with satisfaction. 40 years I have dreamed of this moment every day, every single day in that frozen hell. Do you know what it is like spending 4 decades thinking about revenge, planning it, refining it, perfecting every detail? I know what it is like spending 4 decades trying to forget, trying to be someone else, trying to convince yourself that the past stays buried if you just run far enough. And yet here we are. The past never stays buried, does it? It follows us, waits for us, returns when we least expect it. Margaret could see figures still moving in the darkness beyond the tree line. Fewer now, much fewer, but still dangerous. "You have lost half your men, Victor. Soldiers you paid good money for, men with families of their own. And for what an old grudge, a 40-year-old promise made in handcuffs." The radio was silent for a long moment. When Dragunov spoke again, his voice had changed. The rage was still there, but beneath it, something else had surfaced. Something older and more wounded. "You took everything from me, Nightingale. Everything. My career, my freedom, my dignity. But those things, those I could have forgiven. Eventually, those are the costs of the game we chose to play." Then what? My daughter. The word hung in the cold air between them, carried by radio waves across the killing ground. "Irina," he said, and his voice cracked on the name. "She was born 3 months after you put me in prison." 3 months. I never held her, never heard her first word, never saw her take her first step. Her mother raised her alone, and when her mother died, Irina was just 14. 14 years old, and I could not even attend the funeral. Margaret closed her eyes. She had not known about the daughter. In all her intelligence briefings, in all the files she had memorized about Viktor Dragunov, there had been no mention of a child. Perhaps the files had been incomplete. Perhaps it had been deliberately omitted. Or perhaps she had simply stopped looking after she put him in prison, convinced that the story was over. "She grew up without me," Dragunov continued. "She became a teacher. Can you imagine that? The daughter of a KGB colonel teaching children to read. She never visited me. Not once in 35 years. She was ashamed of what I was, of what I had done." His voice broke completely. She died 3 months ago. Cancer. The same kind that probably runs in our family. I found out the day I was released. They handed me my clothes and my personal effects and a letter from a lawyer informing me that my daughter was dead and had left instructions that I was not to attend her funeral. Margaret felt the words settle into her chest like stones. She had spent 40 years telling herself that what she had done in Prague was righteous, that turning Dragunov over to the authorities instead of killing him had been the moral choice. That justice was better than revenge. But justice, she was learning, was not the same thing as clean. Justice left wreckage. Justice had consequences that rippled outward through decades, touching people who had done nothing wrong, whose only crime was being connected to someone who had. A daughter who grew up without a father. A child who was ashamed of the blood that ran in her veins. A woman who died alone, having spent her entire life trying to distance herself from a monster. Margaret keyed the radio. "I'm sorry about your daughter, Victor." Truly. The silence that followed was the longest yet. She could hear the wind moving through the pine trees, could hear the distant sound of a wounded man groaning somewhere in the darkness, could hear the slow, steady rhythm of her own heartbeat, the same heartbeat that had carried her through decades of violence and secrets and running. "Your sorrow means nothing to me," Dragunov said finally, but his voice suggested otherwise. His voice suggested that her words had found a crack in the armor he had spent 4 decades building. "Then come and end this. I am tired of waiting. Are you tired of waiting or tired of running? Tired of being Margaret Sinclair instead of Elena Rohr? Tired of pretending you are someone you are not?" She did not answer. The question did not require one, because the answer was yes. To all of it, she was tired of every mask she had ever worn, tired of every lie she had ever told, tired of the distance between who she was and who she pretended to be. "I am coming now," Dragunov said. "Just you and me, the way it should have been 40 years ago." Margaret set down the radio and looked around the barn loft. Boone was watching her, his face unreadable in the darkness. Below, she could hear Rowan repositioning, could hear Dalton's quiet breathing as the young man held his position with the thermal optics. "He is coming," she said. Boone nodded. "I know. And for what it is worth, I think you did the right thing in Prague. Those children are alive because of you. Whatever happened to his daughter, that is his burden to carry, not yours." Margaret looked at this man who had ridden a motorcycle into her life less than 72 hours ago and had somehow become someone she trusted with her life. "Stay on that rifle," she said, "and if things go wrong, you take the shot. Do not hesitate. Do not second guess. You take the shot. And if things go right, then nobody else dies tonight." He emerged from the tree line at 0400, alone, walking slowly, deliberately, a pistol in one hand and something else in the other. As he drew closer, Margaret saw what it was through the rifle scope Boone had trained on him. A photograph. Old, faded, creased from decades of handling. She recognized it even from 50 yards away. The children from Prague. All 52 of them standing in front of the orphanage where she had taken them after the rescue. Smiling, safe, alive. "You saved them," Dragunov called out, stopping 30 feet from the house, all of them. "Do you know what happened to them? Do you know how their lives turned out?" Margaret set down the radio, checked the Glock one final time. 15 rounds. Arthritis in her left hand but steady in her right. Heart beating slow and even the way it had always beaten in moments like this. Not calm, not fear, something in between. The place where the two met and canceled each other out, leaving nothing but clarity. She opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. Behind her, she could hear Boone's sharp intake of breath, Rowan's muttered curse, Dalton's silence, which was somehow louder than both. But she ignored them all. This moment had been coming for 40 years. There was no avoiding it now. The Glock hung at her side, not yet raised. She wanted to see him first. Wanted to look into the eyes of the man who had haunted her for 4 decades before either of them made a decision that could not be unmade. Dragunov stood in the pale glow of pre-dawn light. He was smaller than as she remembered, thinner. The decades had carved him down to essential components, like a sculpture weathered by wind, until only the hardest stone remained. His face was a map of years spent in darkness. Deep lines around eyes that had once been sharp as broken glass, but now held something she had not expected to see. Exhaustion. Bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion. The kind that came not from lack of sleep, but from carrying a weight too heavy for too long. The kind she recognized because she had carried the same weight herself. His suit was dark, expensive, incongruous against the Montana wilderness. A man dressed for a boardroom, standing on a killing field. His pistol was a Makarov, the old Soviet service weapon. He had probably carried it since before her time. The kind of sentimental attachment that spoke of a man who defined himself by his past rather than his present. They stood 30 feet apart, two old enemies, two relics of a war that had ended before half the people in the world were born. The distance between them measured not in feet but in decades, in choices made and consequences endured, in children saved and children lost. They lived, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold morning air. All 52 of them. They grew up, had families, normal lives, doctors, teachers, engineers, all because of you. He held up the photograph. She could see it clearly now. The edges were soft from handling, the colors faded by time, but the faces were still visible. 52 children, most of them smiling. She had taken that photograph herself the morning after the rescue, standing in the courtyard of a Prague orphanage with a borrowed camera and hands that shook from exhaustion and relief. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked like ice breaking on a river in spring. And do you know what happened to my daughter Irina, the one I never got to see grow up? Because I was in prison. She died free, Margaret said quietly. That is more than those children would have had if you had sold them. She died alone. Dragunov's control shattered. 40 years of contained rage finally breaking free, like watching a dam collapse in slow motion. The water behind it dark and ancient and full of things that should have stayed buried. 35 years I rotted in that cell while you played house in America. She grew up without a father. She got sick and I could not even visit her. She died calling for me and I could not answer because I was locked in a cage on the other side of the world. You took everything from me. Margaret held her ground. The Glock was in her hand now, but she had not raised it. She stood on the porch of the house Edward had helped her build on the land she had chosen for its isolation and its sightlines and its distance from everything she had been. And she felt something she had not expected to feel. Compassion, not forgiveness. What Dragunov had done, the children he had sold, the lives he had destroyed, those things could not be forgiven. Not by her, not by anyone. But compassion was different from forgiveness. Compassion was simply the recognition that even monsters could suffer, that even the worst among us carried wounds that bled. You took it from yourself, she said, and her voice was gentler than either of them expected. Every child you sold, every life you destroyed. You chose this path, Victor, not me. I just made sure you paid for those choices. And your daughter, she chose her own path too. She became a teacher. She spent her life helping children. Maybe that was because of what you did. Maybe it was in spite of it. But it was her choice, not yours, not mine. Dragunov raised his pistol. The weapon trembled in his aged hand. Once that hand had been steady enough to execute men at point-blank range without flinching. Now it shook with the palsy of age and grief and rage that had eaten him alive for 4 decades. Margaret raised the Glock. Her hand was steady, despite the arthritis, despite the years, despite everything. The muscle memory was there encoded so deeply that no amount of time could erase it. She sighted center mass the way she had been trained, the way she had practiced 10,000 times in ranges across 3 continents. 2 old warriors, facing each other across 40 years of hate and choices and consequences neither could undo. The air between them thick with ghosts. 52 children who had grown into adults. A daughter who had lived and died without knowing her father. A husband who had died squeezing his wife's hand. An agency that had burned its files and buried its secrets. A world that had moved on, leaving these two standing in the wreckage of a war that most people had forgotten was ever fought. Do it, Dragunov whispered. His accent thicker now, the English breaking apart under the weight of emotion. End this, please. I am so tired. And Margaret could see that he meant it, could see in his eyes the same exhaustion she felt in her own bones, the same weariness of a life spent carrying burdens that should have been set down decades ago. She could end it, one pull of the trigger, one bullet, and Viktor Dragunov would join the list of ghosts that already haunted her. Another name to add to the silent roll call she carried in her heart. Another face to see in the small hours of the morning when sleep would not come and the darkness was full of memories. The shot came from neither of them. Dalton Finch, positioned in the barn loft beside Boone, fired once. The young man who had been beaten and left for dead 3 days ago, who had never held a rifle before yesterday, who had spent his whole life running from violence, hiding from it, flinching at the sound of raised voices, because raised voices in his world had always been the prelude to pain. He fired, and the bullet struck true. Dragunov's pistol spun from his shattered wrist, clattering across the gravel like a dropped coin. The old Russian fell to his knees, clutching his arm, blood seeping between his fingers. He looked up at Margaret with eyes that held rage and pain and something else entirely. Relief, the kind of relief that came from having a decision made for you, from having the burden of choice lifted by someone else's hand. He had wanted to die, wanted her to pull the trigger, wanted the end that would finally free him from the weight of his own existence. Instead, he was alive, and the decision of what happened next was no longer his to make. In the barn loft, Dalton lowered the rifle with hands that had begun to shake. The adrenaline that had steadied his aim was draining away, leaving behind the raw reality of what he had just done. He had shot a man, the first time in his life he had deliberately caused harm to another human being, and the weight of it settled on his shoulders like a physical thing. Boone was beside him in an instant, one hand on his shoulder. No words, just presence. The presence of someone who understood what that first shot cost, who had carried the same weight after his own first engagement in Afghanistan, and knew that the only thing worse than pulling the trigger was not pulling it when it mattered. "Good shot," Boone said quietly. "You saved her life." Dalton nodded. He could not speak. His throat had closed around words he did not have. But he did not look away from the scene below, did not flinch, did not hide from the consequence of his choice. The boy who had spent his life running from violence had finally stopped running. Not because the violence had ended, but because he had found something worth standing for. Margaret lowered her weapon slowly, deliberately. Every person watching understood the significance of that gesture. She was choosing. In the most public and irrevocable way possible, she was making a choice that defined not just this moment, but everything that had come before it. No, the word was quiet, but it carried across the killing ground with the weight of 40 years behind it. You do not get the easy way out. You do not get to be a martyr. You do not get to die thinking you were somehow the victim in all this. She stepped off the porch and walked toward him, each step deliberate, each footfall on the gravel a small declaration. She stopped 3 feet away and looked down at the man who had haunted her dreams for 4 decades. "You are going to live, Victor. You are going to stand trial in an American court. You are going to hear testimony from the survivors of Prague, from the children you tried to sell, who are doctors now, teachers, engineers, parents. You are going to sit in that courtroom and listen to them describe what you did, what your operation did. And you are going to spend whatever time you have left in a prison cell knowing that you failed." She paused, letting the words settle. "That those 52 children live full lives despite you. That your daughter became a teacher who helped children. She wanted to be nothing like the man who fathered her. That your legacy is not vengeance or power or fear. Your legacy is that you made the world worse and the people you tried to destroy made it better. That is justice, Victor. Not revenge. Justice." Dragunov laughed, the sound broken and bitter blood flecking his lips from where he had bitten his tongue when Dalton's bullet shattered his wrist. 40 years, all of this. For what? For nothing. Not nothing. Margaret knelt beside him, not in triumph, not in dominance, but in the simple recognition that they were both old, both tired, both carrying wounds that would never fully heal. "Those children lived because of what I did. They had families, careers, lives. That is not nothing, Victor. That is everything." The sound of helicopters thundered overhead, spotlights turning the night into artificial day. FBI hostage rescue team right on schedule. Thomas Hartwell had kept his promise. The helicopters descended like mechanical angels, their rotors flattening the grass and sending gravel skittering across the driveway. Men in tactical gear fast roped to the ground with practiced efficiency, securing the perimeter with the speed and precision of an operation rehearsed a dozen times before it was executed once. Federal agents swarmed the property, securing the scene, treating the wounded, processing the dead. Medics appeared treating injured on both sides without distinction. Law and mercy functioning simultaneously. Margaret stepped back, letting them work. She felt the adrenaline draining from her body like water from a cracked vessel, leaving behind a hollowness that was not quite emptiness and not quite peace. Something in between, the way most of her life had been lived. A senior agent found her on the porch. He was 40-something, square-jawed, with a particular intensity of someone who had been briefed on the significance of this operation by people well above his pay grade. "Ma'am, I am Special Agent Crawford. We have been monitoring this situation via satellite for the past 12 hours. Director Hartwell sends his regards." Margaret nodded. "There are wounded who need immediate evacuation. One of my people, Sullivan Briggs, has a through-and-through gunshot wound to the left shoulder. He has lost significant blood, and one of ours is dead. His name is Webb. He has a wife named Helen in Missoula. She needs to be notified with dignity." Crawford hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to receiving operational debriefings from a 73-year-old woman in a house dress. But something in her voice, in the precision of her language, and the steadiness of her gaze told him this was not a woman to be managed or patronized. "Yes, ma'am, we will take care of it." She watched as Dragunov was handcuffed and led away. The old Russian walked slowly, his injured wrist cradled against his chest, flanked by agents who held him with professional detachment. He did not resist, did not struggle. The fight had gone out of him the moment Dalton's bullet shattered his weapon and Margaret's words shattered something deeper. He looked back once, his eyes meeting hers across the case of flashing lights and shouted commands and the organized confusion of a federal operation in full motion. She did not look away, did not flinch, just watched until he disappeared into the back of an armored vehicle. The door closed, the engine started, and Viktor Dragunov left her life for the final time, carried away not by vengeance, but by the same justice she had chosen 40 years ago in Prague. Boone found her sitting on the porch steps as dawn broke over the mountains. The sky was turning from black to purple to the deep luminous blue that existed only in Montana, only at this hour, only in this particular slant of light. The property looked like a battlefield, because it was one. Scattered across 50 acres, the evidence of the night's violence lay in stark relief against the peaceful landscape. Shell casings glittering in the morning dew, scorched earth where flares had burned, dark stains on pale gravel that would take rain and time to wash away. Federal agents moved through it all with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to cleaning up after the worst that humanity could offer. Evidence bags, photographs, numbered markers placed beside each, spent casing each bloodstain, each fallen weapon. The bureaucracy of violence reducing a night of terror and courage into data points and case files. Boone sat down beside her on the steps. His rifle was gone, surrendered to the FBI as evidence. His hands were empty for the first time in hours. They looked strange without a weapon in them, vulnerable. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence between them was comfortable. The silence of people who had shared something too profound for words. "Webb," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Boone replied. "He was a good man. He died holding his position, holding it so the rest of us could live. That is how he would have wanted it. No one wants to die, Mr. Gallagher. They just want their death to mean something if it comes." She turned the photograph over in her hands. 52 faces, a lifetime of wait. He had a wife. I heard him mention her name once. Helen. She will need to be told. Sullivan is handling it. He has done this before, too many times. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows. Somewhere behind them, medics were treating Sullivan's shoulder wound. The big man had refused a stretcher, insisting on walking to the ambulance under his own power. Even now, even with a hole through his shoulder and blood soaking through his bandages, he carried himself with the rigid dignity of a man who would not let his brother see him falter. Dalton was sitting on the tailgate of a pickup truck 40 yards away, staring at his hands. The hands that had fired the shot that ended the standoff. Rowan stood beside him, one arm in a sling, the other resting on the young man's shoulder. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Margaret watched them for a long moment. The boy who had been beaten and left for dead. The mechanic with the broken arm. standing together in the aftermath of something that would mark them for the rest of their lives. Is he going to be all right, she asked, nodding toward Dalton. Boone followed her gaze. He will be. It is a hard thing the first time you pull a trigger on a real person. Takes a while to sort through it, but he did the right thing. He saved your life. He saved all of us. She stood her knees protesting with the familiar ache that had become her constant companion. The Glock was still tucked in the small of her back. She removed it, ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and set the weapon on the porch railing with a finality that felt like setting down a stone she had been carrying uphill for decades. I think I am done with guns, she said quietly. Boone looked at the weapon, then at her. A smile crossed his face. The first genuine smile she had seen from him since the morning they met. I think you have earned that. The weeks that followed were strange, quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. Like the silence after a thunderstorm when the air is clean and charged and everything smells of rain and new beginnings. The FBI investigation took most of November. Agents came and went asking questions that Margaret answered with the selective honesty of someone who had spent decades navigating the space between truth and classification. She told them what they needed to know, omitted what they did not. Thomas Hartwell had arranged for certain aspects of her history to remain sealed classified under executive order, untouchable by prosecutors or journalists or anyone else who might come looking. The Serpents Motorcycle Club was dismantled within 3 weeks. DEA agents, armed with intelligence that Judith Pemberton had quietly channeled through official channels, executed simultaneous raids on 6 properties across Montana, 23 arrests, enough drugs to fill a shipping container, enough weapons to arm a small militia. The network Viktor Dragunov had built with Russian money and criminal ambition dismantled in a single coordinated operation. Holt testified in exchange for a reduced sentence. Margaret had recommended leniency in her statement to the FBI. The boy had made a mistake born of fear and desperation, not malice. He had turned it around when it mattered. That counted for something. Webb was buried on a Tuesday. Gray sky, cold wind, the kind of weather that made funerals feel honest. The Iron Wolves rode in formation behind the hearse engines, rumbling like a prayer spoken in a language only they understood. Margaret rode with Boone sitting behind him on a borrowed Harley the Iron Wolves vest she had not yet earned pressed against her chest. Helen Webb, a quiet woman with strong hands and steady eyes, accepted the folded flag that Sullivan presented with a nod that said she understood. That she had always understood the risks. That she had loved her husband, not despite the danger, but within it. After the service, Helen found Margaret standing by herself at the edge of the cemetery. The two women looked at each other for a long moment. 2 widows. 2 women who had lost the men they loved and found ways to keep living anyway. He talked about you, Helen said. Called you the toughest lady he had ever met. Said you reminded him of his grandmother. Used to carry a shotgun in one hand and a Bible in the other. Margaret smiled through the ache in her chest. He held the line when it mattered. He saved lives, that night, including mine. I wish I could have saved his. Helen took her hand, squeezed it once, firm and final. He chose to be there. Same as you chose to take those boys in. Same as you chose to fight instead of run. We all make our choices. Sometimes they cost us everything, but that does not make them wrong. She walked away without looking back. The straight spine and steady gait of a woman who would grieve on her own terms in her own time without an audience. Margaret stood by the grave for a long time after everyone else had gone. She had attended too many funerals in her life, had stood over too many graves. Each one added weight to the burden she carried. But she did not believe that the weight was something to be avoided or diminished. The weight was the proof that those lives had mattered, that their loss meant something. The months that followed brought a kind of healing she had not expected. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of healing where everything suddenly makes sense and the pain disappears. The real kind, slow, imperfect, built one ordinary day at a time. She started teaching a self-defense class at the community center in town. Nothing fancy, no martial arts demonstrations or tactical maneuvers, just practical skills for women who wanted to feel safer walking to their cars at night. It was the first time in her life she had used her training for something that felt entirely good. Entirely clean. She wrote letters to Edward, sat on the porch on quiet evenings, and told him about the men who had become her family. About the fight that had changed everything. about the woman she was becoming now that she had finally stopped pretending to be someone else. "I think you would have liked them," she wrote in one letter she would never send. "They are loud and stubborn, and they drink terrible beer. But they love each other the way you loved me. Completely. Without conditions. Without asking permission." Dalton came by the ranch every Wednesday evening. He said it was to help with the chickens, but they both knew the real reason. He sat at her kitchen table and asked questions. Not about tradecraft or combat or the Cold War. About life. About how to be the kind of person who did the right thing even when it was hard. About how to live with the things you had done and the things you had failed to do. She answered as honestly as she could, which was not always honestly enough. Some things she still could not say. Some memories she still could not share. But she gave him what she could, and he took it with the gratitude of a young man who had spent his entire life looking for someone who would not look the other way. 18 months later, Margaret stood in the Iron Wolves clubhouse in Missoula, surrounded by men who had become family in the truest sense of the word. The room smelled of leather and motor oil and the particular brand of cheap beer that bikers seemed to favor regardless of how much money they had. Someone had strung Christmas lights across the ceiling, giving the whole place a warm glow that softened the rough edges. A framed photograph hung on the wall near the bar. Webb, smiling, leaning against his motorcycle on some sun-drenched road, squinting into the camera, with the casual confidence of a man who did not know that his future held both sacrifice and honor. Beneath the photograph, a brass plate read simply, "He held the line." Margaret paused before it every time she came to the clubhouse. Touched the frame briefly with her fingertips. A gesture so small that most people would not notice it. But the men who knew her understood what it meant. Understood that she carried Webb's death the way she carried all the deaths. Not as guilt, but as responsibility. As a debt that could only be repaid by living a life worthy of the sacrifice. The clubhouse was full tonight. Not just Iron Wolves, but their families. Wives and girlfriends and children who ran between the tables, shrieking with the particular joy of kids who have been told they can stay up past bedtime. It was Margaret reflected the loudest place she had ever felt peaceful. Sullivan Briggs approached with a leather vest folded carefully in his massive hands. His left arm still moved stiffly from the shoulder wound, but the doctors said full mobility would return eventually. The scar would remain. He wore it with the same casual pride he wore the others' marks of a life lived at full contact. The vest was black, worn soft by years of use, covered in patches that told stories only other bikers would understand. One patch was new, placed over the heart, where it would rest closest to the wearer. It read, "Nightingale, Honorary Member, Iron Wolves MC." The club voted, Sullivan said, his gravel voice unusually gentle. "Unanimous. First time in 20 years we have been unanimous on anything. You ride with us now if you want." Margaret took the vest with hands that trembled slightly. Not from age or arthritis, though both were present. From emotions she could not quite name. Pride, maybe? Belonging? The sensation of finally, after 7 decades of life, finding a place where she fit. She slipped the vest on over her cardigan. It was too big. The shoulders hung past her frame. The leather smelled of road dust and engine grease and the particular scent of men who had been riding together for years. It should have looked absurd. An old woman in a biker vest, silver hair and reading glasses and sensible shoes. It looked like home. "I have never belonged anywhere," she said, her voice thick. "Never had a family except Edward, and he has been gone 8 years now. I thought I would die alone." "You have family now." Boone stepped forward, Rowan and Dalton flanking him. All three bore scars from that night. Boone's head wound had left a thin white line through his hair. Rowan's arm was still in a brace, healing slower than doctors had hoped. Dalton walked with a slight limp that might be permanent, but they stood straighter, stronger, changed by what they had survived together. "We are getting the club out of the gray area," Boone said, his voice carrying pride. "Going legit. Sullivan is opening a security consulting firm. Uses his SEAL background, helps companies with threat assessment. Rowan is teaching mechanics at the community college, showing kids there is honest work if they want it. And Smoke here?" He clapped Dalton on the shoulder with genuine affection. "Just got accepted to the police academy." Dalton grinned. Still young, but no longer a boy. The fear that had lived in his eyes was gone, replaced by something harder and more durable. "Someone has got to keep you old-timers in line. Figure I might as well get paid for it." The celebration lasted until dawn. There was food and beer, and the kind of laughter that came from people who had faced death together and won. Stories were told and retold, each version getting slightly more exaggerated, slightly more heroic. Someone produced a guitar. Someone else sang Johnny Cash in a voice that was not half bad. Webb's name was spoken with reverence and raised glasses, the way soldiers had honored their fallen for centuries. When Margaret finally returned to her ranch, the sun was painting the Bitterroot Mountains in shades of gold and crimson. She found someone waiting on her porch holding 2 cups of coffee. Thomas Hartwell. 77 now, his hair completely white, his face carved by decades of secrets and decisions that had shaped the world in ways most people would never know. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing her one of the cups. They sat in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the mountains emerge from shadow into light. The coffee was good, strong and black, the way she had always taken it. "Dragunov died in prison last week," Hartwell said, finally, his voice matter of fact. "Heart attack, quick, painless. More than he deserved, probably." But there it is. Margaret nodded. She had made peace with it all. The choices she had made in Prague, the decades of hiding that had followed, the stand she had finally taken when hiding was no longer an option. All of it woven together into a life that was messy and complicated and somehow against all odds good. "I am glad you did not run." Hartwell continued, his eyes on the distant peaks. "Glad you stood and fought." The Elena roar. "I knew the nightingale who destroyed an entire KGB network to save 52 children. She would have done the same thing." "I am not Elena Roar anymore." "No," he smiled, and it transformed his face. "You are something better. You are someone who found family in the unlikeliest place. Someone who proved that it is never too late to stop hiding. Never too late to find home." "There is something else," he said, setting his cup down. "There is a ceremony next month. Arlington National Cemetery. They are dedicating a memorial to the children rescued from Prague in 1984. All 52 of them are contributing. They want you there." Her breath caught. "They know, they have always known. Not your real name, not where you went. But they knew someone risked everything to save them. They have been trying to find you for years." Judith finally told them about Margaret Sinclair, about the woman who saved 3 bikers and fought off a Russian hit squad at 73. They connected the dots. "I do not know if I can." They are not asking for speeches or recognition. They just want to say thank you to the woman who gave them their lives back. He paused at the steps. "You spent 40 years believing you had to hide. Maybe it is time to let yourself be seen, to accept that what you did mattered, that you mattered." Hartwell drove away in a rental sedan, disappearing down the long driveway as the sun climbed higher. Margaret sat alone on the porch for a long time, the photograph of 52 children resting in her lap. She went to Arlington. Boone drove her. He said nothing during the long drive east, just sat behind the wheel of a rented truck and let the miles pass in comfortable silence. When they crossed his border into Virginia, Margaret felt something shift inside her. She had not been back to this state since 1989, since the woman she used to be had died in a warehouse fire and been reborn as someone else. The landscape was familiar and foreign at the same time. The rolling hills, the hardwood forests, the particular quality of light that existed nowhere else in the world. She had been a girl here once, before Prague, before Budapest, before the farm and the passports and the 30 years of service that had consumed her youth and left her with nothing but scars and secrets. On a crisp November morning, she stood among the marble headstones in the quiet dignity of a place that held the weight of a nation's sacrifices. 52 men and women, most of them in their 50s, now gathered around a modest stone marker that bore no name, only a date. Prague, 1984. They did not know her face. 4 decades had changed them both beyond recognition. They knew only that the woman they had come to thank was somewhere in the crowd, watching, listening. A woman stepped forward to speak. She was 54, with dark hair streaked with gray, in the calm, steady hands of someone accustomed to holding lives in her care. A pediatrician from Chicago. She had been 7 years old when Margaret opened that shipping container and found her huddled in the darkness, too afraid to cry. "I do not know your real name," the woman said, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "I do not know where you live or what you have done in the years since you saved us. But I want you to know that I became a doctor because of you. Because someone showed me at 7 years old that there were people in this world who would fight for children they had never met, who would risk everything for strangers. She paused, her composure wavering for just a moment. I have spent my career caring for children, thousands of them. And every time I hold a sick child's hand, every time I sit with a frightened parent, every time I fight for a life that the statistics say cannot be saved, I think of you. I think of the woman who opened that door and let the light in. Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. She had not cried since Edward died, had not allowed herself that particular vulnerability. But standing here among the graves of heroes and the living proof of her greatest choice, she could not hold it back. The woman looked out at the crowd, searching. If you are here, she said softly, if you can hear me, thank you. For all of us, thank you for stopping. Margaret stepped forward. She did not plan it, did not make a conscious decision. Her feet simply moved, carrying her toward the woman she had saved 40 years ago. The woman she had carried in her memory through decades of hiding and pretending to be someone else. Their eyes met, and in that moment recognition passed between them. Not of faces or names, but of something deeper. The connection between a woman who had saved a child's life and the child who had grown up to save others. The doctor took Margaret's hand. Her grip was warm and firm and alive. It is you, she whispered. Margaret nodded. She could not speak. The words would not come through the tightness in her throat. They stood together in the November sunlight, surrounded by marble and memory, and the quiet understanding that some choices echo forward through decades, rippling outward in ways their makers can never predict. Margaret drove back to Montana that evening, Boone beside her this time, taking a turn at the wheel while she slept against the passenger window. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she slept without dreaming, without waking in the small hours to check the windows and listen for engines, without reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. She slept the way people sleep when they are finally irrevocably safe, not from the world. The world would always be dangerous, but from themselves, from the weight of secrets carried too long and truth is spoken too late. The highway unwound before them like a ribbon of asphalt stretching toward the mountains and the life she had built among them. The Iron Wolf's vest lay on the back seat beside the photograph of 52 children and a small envelope the doctor from Chicago had pressed into her hand before they parted. Inside a drawing, made by a 7-year-old girl in a Prague orphanage 40 years ago. A woman with wings standing in a doorway, light spilling in behind her. She had kept it all this time. They arrived home at dusk. The ranch was quiet. The chickens had put themselves to bed. The lavender had been harvested weeks ago, but its scent still lingered in the air, stubborn and enduring. Margaret brewed coffee, black, no sugar, sat on the porch and listened to the evening settle around her, the creak of the house cooling, the distant call of an owl, the wind moving through pine trees with a sound like whispered conversation. Boone sat beside her for a while. They did not speak. They had moved beyond the need for words months ago. Eventually he stood, squeezed her shoulder once, and rode away on his Harley, the engine, note fading into the mountain twilight like a benediction. From down the road a few minutes later, she could hear more engines. The distinctive rumble of Harleys, the Iron Wolves coming for their weekly Sunday dinner. A tradition they had started 6 months ago and showed no signs of stopping. Boone would bring fresh eggs from the chickens he had started raising. Rowan would contribute homemade sausage, a recipe passed down from his grandmother. Dalton would arrive with pastries from the bakery in town, still warm from the oven. And they would all sit around her kitchen table, eating and talking and being the family none of them had known they needed. Arguing about football and motorcycles and whether Margaret's coffee was too strong. It was always too strong. She would not apologize for it. Margaret sipped her coffee and smiled. On the mantel inside, the photograph of Edward still held its place, but beside it now sat a new photograph. 10 men and 1 woman standing in front of a weathered cedar house with the Bitterroot Mountains rising behind them, all of them wearing leather vests, all of them grinning. The woman in the center, silver-haired and small, looked like someone's grandmother. She was someone's grandmother in every way that mattered. And beside both photographs, the drawing from Prague. A child's rendering of a woman with wings standing in a doorway letting the light in. She was 73 years old. She had arthritis and scars and memories that sometimes woke her in the middle of the night. But she also had family, purpose, a life that mattered, a vest that smelled of road dust and brotherhood, a kitchen table that was too small for the people who gathered around it every Sunday and too full of love to notice. And for the first time in 40 years, she had peace. The nightingale had finally stopped singing songs of war. Now she sang of home. The first light of dawn found Margaret in the kitchen, standing over the stove with a cast-iron skillet that had been Edward's mother's. She was frying eggs. 6 of them, 2 for each of the men, sleeping in her living room, cooked the way field rations never were, with butter and salt and the kind of care that came from a woman who understood that a hot meal could do what medicine sometimes could not. Dalton was the first to wake. He sat up slowly on the air mattress, wincing, one hand pressed to the side of his head, where the swelling had begun to recede, but the pain remained. He blinked at the kitchen light, at the woman standing at the stove with a spatula in one hand and a Glock holstered at her hip, and for a moment his expression held the pure confusion of someone who had woken up in a story that made no sense. "Mrs. Sinclair, good morning. Eggs are almost ready. There is coffee on the counter. Help yourself, but be careful, the pot is hot." Dalton stood on unsteady legs and shuffled to the kitchen. He poured himself a mug of coffee with hands that still trembled slightly, whether from the concussion or from the memory of the previous day. Margaret could not tell. He took a sip and grimaced. "This is strong." "Yes, it is." He sat at the kitchen table and watched her cook. There was something in his posture that she recognized. The hunched shoulders, the downcast eyes, the way he made himself as small as possible, as though occupying less space in the world might protect him from whatever the world had planned. She had seen it in children who had grown up afraid, in assets who had been broken by interrogation, in soldiers who had come home from wars that never really ended. "You have questions," she said, not looking up from the skillet. "Yeah, a lot of them. Ask." He was quiet for a moment, turning the coffee mug in his hands. Then, "How did you do it? Live like 2 different people for so long. How did you keep track of which one was real?" Margaret slid the eggs onto a plate and set it in front of him. She sat down across the table, her own mug of coffee untouched, and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I did not keep track," she said. "That is the honest answer. For the first few years, Elena Rohr was real, and all the other names were masks. But after Prague, after I burned everything down and faked my death, Elena stopped feeling real too. She became another mask, another identity that belonged to someone I used to be." She looked at the mug in her hands, the chipped ceramic, the faded floral pattern, the same mug she had used every morning for 15 years. "When I became Margaret Sinclair, dear, I told myself it was just another cover, another name, another lie. But then I met Edward, and he did not fall in love with Elena Rohr or Nightingale or any of the other women I had been. He fell in love with Margaret, the woman who planted lavender and went to church and made jam from the raspberries that grew wild along the fence line. And somewhere in there I realized that Margaret was not a lie anymore. She was who I had become." Dalton processed this. His eggs sat untouched, cooling on the plate. "Do you miss her, Elena? I mean, every day, the way you miss someone who died? Because she did die. In that warehouse in Budapest, the woman I had been for 39 years ceased to exist. What walked out of those ashes was someone new. Someone who had to learn how to live without a mission, without a purpose, without anyone telling her who to be or where to go or what to do next." She paused, a faint smile crossing her lips. "Do you know what the hardest part of retirement was? Not the loneliness, not the paranoia, not even the nightmares, though. God knows those were bad enough. The hardest part was going to the grocery store. 30 years of classified service, and I could not figure out how to buy tomatoes without scanning the parking lot for surveillance teams." Dalton almost smiled. "Almost. Eat your eggs," she said. "They are getting cold, and we have a long day ahead of us." He picked up his fork and ate, and Margaret watched him with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had fed too many people their last meal and was grateful, deeply grateful, to be feeding someone their first meal of a new life instead. Boone and Rowan woke within minutes of each other, drawn by the smell of coffee and eggs and the particular domestic normalcy that seemed impossible given the circumstances. They ate in near silence, the 3 men processing the events of the previous day in their own ways. Boone stared out the window, his tactical mind already working through defensive scenarios. Rowan examined his broken arm with the grim pragmatism of a man who had been injured before and knew the difference between pain that healed and pain that did not. Dalton ate slowly, methodically, like someone who had learned not to waste food because he had spent too many nights without it. Margaret cleared the dishes and brewed a second pot of coffee. She moved through the kitchen with the easy efficiency of a woman in her own space opening cabinets without reaching for things by muscle memory. But her eyes kept drifting to the window, to the road, to the distance between here and whatever was coming. "I need to make a call," she said, drying her hands on a dish towel. "And then we need to talk about what happens next." She stepped onto the porch with the satellite phone. The morning air bit at her cheeks, sharp with frost. Her breath made small clouds that dissolved into nothing, the way all breath eventually dissolved. The way all people eventually dissolved. Into memory. Into dust. Into the silence that waited at the end of every story. She dialed the number for Judith Pemberton. It rang 4 times before a woman answered. "Who is this?" The voice was cautious, wary. A voice that had learned not to trust unexpected calls. The voice of a woman who had spent her career in the shadows and never fully stepped back into the light. "Judith, it is Maggie." A long pause, the kind of pause that held decades inside it. Years of friendship and shared danger and the particular bond that formed between people who had kept each other alive in places where death was not just possible but expected. "Maggie Sinclair, after all these years. I thought you were dead." "I was, for a while. But the dead have a way of coming back when they are needed." She explained the situation quickly, efficiently. Judith listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, there was another long silence. She could picture Judith in whatever modest house or apartment she had retired to. 68 now, probably surrounded by books the way she had always been. Probably wearing reading glasses that she refused to admit she needed. "I am 68 years old," Maggie Judith said when she finished. "I have been out of the game for 20 years. What exactly do you think I can do? You still have contacts. People who owe you favors. I need information on Dragunov's current operation. Where he is based, who he is working with, what resources he has access to. Can you get that?" Another pause. Shorter this time. The hesitation of a woman who knew she should say no but could not bring herself to do it. Because some bonds, the bonds forged in the fire of shared service and secret war, did not break. They bent. They stretched. They went dormant for decades. But they did not break. "Give me 4 hours." The line went dead. Margaret set the phone down and looked at the 3 men who had become her unlikely allies. Dawn was breaking over the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. A new day was coming, bringing with it threats and challenges that would test everything she had left. But she was not alone anymore, and that she thought might make all the difference. The hours before the Iron Wolves arrived were spent in preparation of a different kind. Margaret taught Dalton how to apply a pressure bandage with one hand, showed Rowan how to use the shotgun despite his broken arm, propping it against a window frame for stability. Walked Boone through every inch of the property, pointing out the natural features that could serve as cover, as concealment, as kill zones. They moved through the landscape like soldiers on a reconnaissance patrol. Margaret in front, her silver hair catching the light, her arthritic hands pointing and gesturing with the precision of a combat instructor. Boone beside her, absorbing every detail with the concentration of a man who understood that knowledge of terrain could mean the difference between living and dying. "This ridge," she said, stopping at a granite outcropping that overlooked the eastern approach to the property. "Natural firing position, elevation advantage, limited exposure. A good shooter could hold this position against a dozen men if they had enough ammunition and enough patience." Boone studied the terrain with professional appreciation. "You have thought about this before. I have thought about every scenario that could unfold on this property. Every approach, every angle, every possible point of attack, and every possible line of retreat. I have been thinking about it for 15 years. She said it without pride or apology. It was simply fact. The way a mechanic knew the sound of an engine or a doctor knew the feel of a pulse. She knew this land the way she knew her own body. Intimately, completely, with the kind of knowledge that came only from obsession. Back at the house, she made one final preparation that the men did not see. In her bedroom behind the closet door, she had tacked a small piece of paper to the inside of the frame. It had been there since the day she moved in. A list of names, 52 of them, written in her own handwriting, small and precise in ink that had faded but never disappeared. She read them aloud the way she did every night before she slept. A prayer of sorts, or a promise, or simply a reminder that what she had done, the choices she had made, the life she had lived, had been for something. When she reached the last name, she closed the closet door and walked back to the kitchen where three men waited for her. Three men who did not know about the list. Who did not know that every night for 15 years, a 73-year-old woman had stood in her closet and whispered the names of 52 children she had pulled from the dark. Some rituals were private, some prayers were meant to be spoken only to oneself and to whatever force divine or otherwise might be listening. The coffee had gone cold. She poured it out and made a fresh pot. The morning was still young. There was work to be done. Chenso Tron Dang Chuki Sullivan Be Bang Ba Morong Kanchindo. Between the first and second waves, there was a lull that lasted approximately 12 minutes. 12 minutes that felt like 12 hours. 12 minutes in which the only sounds were the groaning of wounded men in the darkness and the distant crack of a branch breaking under someone's weight. Margaret used those 12 minutes the way she had been trained to use every pause in combat. She repositioned, checked ammunition, assessed casualties, moved from position to position, touching each defender on the shoulder as she passed. A small gesture, human contact, reminding them that they were not alone, that someone was watching, that someone cared whether they lived or died. Pike had taken shrapnel from a ricochet, a small piece of stone that had embedded itself in his left forearm. He was wrapping it with a torn piece of his own shirt, his face set in the grim lines of a man who had learned to treat his own wounds in worse conditions than these. "Let me see that," Margaret said, kneeling beside him. "It is fine, just a scratch. It is not a scratch, it is a fragment wound that will get infected if it is not cleaned and dressed properly. Hold still." She cleaned the wound with antiseptic from her medical kit, the same kit she had retrieved from the steel case in the barn. Pike watched her work with an expression that mixed gratitude and something close to wonder. "You really were some kind of spy, huh?" "I prefer the term intelligence officer. Spies are the people we recruit. Officers are the ones who do the recruiting. Same thing, is it not?" "Not even close." She finished the bandage and moved on. In the barn loft, Boone had not moved from his position. His rifle pointed into the darkness, his eye pressed to the scope, his breathing slow and controlled. He had fired 6 rounds during the first wave. All 6 had found their marks. His force recon training was evident in the discipline of his shooting. No wasted rounds, no panic fire, each shot deliberate, each shot lethal. "How many rounds do you have left?" Margaret asked. 14 in the magazine, 2 spare magazines, 42 rounds total. "Make them count." "I always do." Dalton had not moved from his position beside the thermal optics. His face was pale in the darkness, lit only by the faint green glow of the screen. His hands were steady on the equipment, but his breathing was too fast. Shallow. The breathing of someone fighting against fear with nothing but willpower. Margaret placed her hand on his shoulder. "Breathe," she said. "In through the moon, out through the mouth, slow, controlled. Fear wants to speed everything up. Your job is to slow it down." He followed her instructions, his breathing gradually steadying. After a moment, he looked up at her. "Mrs. Sinclair, are we going to die tonight?" She could have lied, could have offered reassurance that she did not feel, could have given him the kind of empty comfort that commanders gave to soldiers before battles they knew they might not survive. Instead, she told him the truth. "I do not know, but I have survived worse odds than this, and so have the men around you. We are not helpless, and we are not alone. That counts for more than you might think. What if it is not enough? Then we make it enough, one decision at a time, one shot at a time, one breath at a time. That is all any of us can do. Focus on the next thing, not the thing after that, not the thing after that, just the next thing." He nodded. His breathing had steadied, the color was returning to his face. Not much, but enough. The second wave announced itself with the hiss of smoke grenades and the sharp crack of suppressive fire. Margaret keyed her radio and felt the entire property shift from stillness to motion, from waiting to action, from the held breath before the plunge to the plunge itself. And in that moment, in the chaos and the noise, in the desperate violence of men fighting for their lives, Margaret Sinclair ceased to exist entirely. The woman who planted lavender and made jam and went to church on Sundays vanished, and in her place stood someone older and harder and infinitely more dangerous. Someone who had survived Prague and Budapest and a dozen other cities whose names were classified. Someone who had carried 52 children out of the dark and buried her own name in the ashes of a burning warehouse. Nightingale. She was back. Chenso Ken Helen Webb de Taingia Trang Mo Rong Quatrin Hoi Phuc. Rowan's recovery was the slowest of the three. His compound fracture required 2 surgeries and months of physical therapy. The doctors at St. Patrick's Hospital in Missoula told him he might never regain full use of his left arm. He told them they did not know him very well. He came to Margaret's ranch every Saturday morning, his arm in a sling, a toolbox in his good hand. He said he was there to fix things. The leaky faucet in the kitchen, the crooked barn door that had been hanging wrong for 2 decades, the section of fencing along the north pasture that the winter storms had knocked down. Margaret let him work. She understood what he was doing. Understood that men like Rowan process pain through labor, through the physical act of making things right, of taking something broken and putting it back together with their hands. It was the same impulse that had made him a mechanic. The belief that the world could be fixed if you had the right tools and enough patience. Sometimes they worked together in companionable silence, Margaret holding boards while Rowan hammered nails one-handed. Sometimes they talked, not about the battle or the injuries or the men who had died, about other things, about Rowan's daughter who he had not seen in 3 years because her mother had moved to Portland and taken the girl with her, about Margaret's garden and the particular challenges of growing lavender in Montana's unforgiving climate, about Edward and the way he used to hum while he worked always the same 3 songs, always slightly off-key. "He sounds like a good man," Rowan said one Saturday, his voice gruff with the particular tenderness that large men sometimes carried for small memories. "He was the best man I ever knew," Margaret replied. "And I have known a lot of men. Some of them were brave, some of them were brilliant, some of them were dangerous in ways that would give you nightmares. But Edward was the only one who was kind, truly kind, in the way that costs something, in the way that requires courage of a different sort." She handed him a nail and held the board steady. "He knew what I was," she continued. "Never asked for details, never pushed, just loved me and trusted that whatever I had done, whatever I was hiding from, was something I had good reason to hide. He built that cellar for me without asking a single question. Built it with his own hands, reinforced the walls, installed the ventilation system. And when it was finished, he kissed me on the forehead and said, 'Now you are safe, Maggie. Now you can rest.'" Rowan was quiet for a long time, driving nails with methodical precision. "I think that is why the club voted you in," he said finally. "Not because of the fighting, not because of the spy stuff. Because you remind us of what it looks like when someone cares enough to build something worth defending. A home, a family, a place where people can rest." Margaret looked at him, at this big, quiet man with the broken arm and the gentle eyes, at the way he held the hammer with such careful precision, even with only one working hand, at the way he spoke about her home as though it were something sacred. "Thank you, Rowan," she said, "for fixing my fence." He smiled, a rare expression on his weathered face. "Anytime, Mrs. Sinclair. Anytime." Boone's path was different. He threw himself into the security consulting firm with the same intensity he had brought to Force Recon. Within 6 months, Briggs & Gallagher Security Solutions had contracts with 3 major corporations and a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsession. Boone traveled frequently assessing threats and vulnerabilities at facilities across the Northwest. But he always came home to Missoula. Always showed up on Sunday mornings with fresh eggs and a story about some corporate executive who could not understand why their building needed better locks. He called Margaret once a week, sometimes to ask for advice, sometimes to share a success, sometimes just to hear her voice. The conversations were never long. Neither of them were given to lengthy phone calls, but they were consistent, reliable. The kind of contact that said, "I am here, and you are not forgotten, and this thing between us, this family we built from blood and circumstance, it is real." One evening about 8 months after the battle, Boone arrived at the ranch unannounced. He sat on the porch steps with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses and did not speak for nearly 30 minutes. Margaret sat beside him, drinking her glass slowly, watching the sun go down, waiting. "I had a nightmare," he said finally. His voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a man who had learned to discuss terrible things without letting them touch him. "About that night, about the men I killed." Margaret waited. "I have had nightmares before. Afghanistan was full of them. Men I killed, friends I lost, choices I made that I cannot unmake. But this one was different. In this one, I was not shooting at soldiers. I was shooting at men who were trying to kill an old woman who reminded me of my grandmother. He poured himself another glass. And in the dream, after it was over, I walked through the property and counted the bodies. And every single one of them had the face of someone I knew. My father, my brother, Boone, who died in Helmand, Rodriguez, who stepped on an IED outside Kandahar. And I realized that the dream was not about the killing. It was about the cost. The accumulated cost of every life I have taken, every trigger I have pulled, every time I chose violence, because I could not see another way. Margaret set her glass down. I have had that dream, she said. Different faces, different places, but the same dream, the cost dream, the one where you walk through the wreckage and realize that every person you have ever harmed is connected to you now, permanently, that their faces will live in your memory for as long as you live, whether you want them there or not. How do you live with it? She considered the question carefully. The same way you live with anything that cannot be changed, you carry it, you acknowledge its weight. You do not pretend it is not there. And you try every day to make choices that add something to the world instead of taking something away. Not to make up for what you have done. You cannot make up for it, but to prove that you learned something from it, that the cost was not wasted. Boone stared at the mountains for a long time. The sun had gone down. The sky was deepening from gold to purple to the vast star-scattered black of a Montana night. Thank you, he said. For what? For not telling me it gets easier. It does not get easier. It gets different. The weight does not go away, but you get stronger. And eventually, if you are lucky, you find people who help you carry it. He looked at her then, and in the darkness she could see the shine of something in his eyes that might have been tears, but might also have been starlight. I think I found those people, he said quietly. Margaret put her hand on his arm, the same gesture she had made in the barn loft the night before the battle. Small, brief, but carrying everything that needed to be said. I think you did too. Chen Truk Ken Arlington Morong Ken Dalton Tai Hoc Vien Ken Sat. Dalton's acceptance into the police academy was the subject of considerable discussion among the Iron Wolves. Some of them found it hilarious. The prospect, who had never thrown a punch in his life, who had spent his youth hiding from violence rather than seeking it, was going to become a cop. Others found it appropriate. A young man who knew what it felt like to be helpless, choosing to become someone who helped the helpless. There was a symmetry to it that appealed to men who believed in things like fate and karma and the universe having a sense of humor. Margaret drove him to the academy on his first day. He sat in the passenger seat of her old truck, wearing clothes he had bought with money he had earned, working at the community center, his hair cut short, his face clean-shaven, looking for all the world like a different person than the bleeding boy who had been dumped in her driveway a year and a half ago. Nervous, she asked. Terrified. Good. Remember what I told you about fear, that it is the prerequisite for courage. That is right. You cannot be brave without first being afraid. And you, Dalton Finch, are about to become very brave indeed. He looked out the window at the academy buildings, low functional structures that held the promise of something he had never had before. Structure, purpose, a place in the world that was his by right and not by accident, Mrs. Sinclair. Yes, that night when I took the shot, when I hit Dragunov's hand and the gun went flying. I did not think about it. I did not aim or calculate or do any of the things you taught me. I just saw him raising the pistol toward you, and my body moved before my mind could catch up. I pulled the trigger because the thought of losing you was more frightening than the thought of taking a life. He turned to face her, his eyes holding the particular intensity of a young man who has discovered something important about himself and needs to say it aloud before it slips away. I think that is what courage is, not the absence of fear, not even the management of fear. It is having something you are more afraid of losing than you are afraid of the danger in front of you. For me, that night it was you, the idea that you might die, that the woman who saw me when nobody else did, the woman who stopped when everybody else kept walking, might be taken from the world. Margaret's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She blinked hard twice against the moisture that threatened to blur her vision. I think you are going to make a very fine police officer, Dalton. He smiled, the real smile. The one that had been hiding behind the fear for 25 years, waiting for the moment when it was safe to emerge. I learned from the best. She watched him walk through the academy gates, straight back, steady stride, hands at his sides no longer trembling. He did not look back. He did not need to. He knew she was watching. He knew she would always be watching. Margaret sat in the truck for a long time after he disappeared inside. She thought about the list in her closet, the 52 names she whispered every night. She would add a 53rd tonight, not because Dalton had been rescued from a shipping container in Prague, but because he had been rescued from something equally dark, from a life without love or safety or the simple belief that someone in the world gave a damn whether he lived or died. 53 names now. 53 reasons to believe that what she had done with her life, all of it, the lies and the killing and the decades of hiding, had been worth something. She started the truck and drove home. The mountains were waiting. Chenso Kankoi Epilogue Morong Ket Tho Quan Chin. On a Sunday morning in late spring, nearly 2 years after the night that changed everything, Margaret woke to the sound of Harleys on her driveway and the smell of coffee she had not made. She lay in bed for a moment listening, the familiar rumble of engines, the sound of boots on gravel, laughter male and boisterous and completely inappropriate for 7 in the morning. Someone was arguing about something. Someone else was singing badly in a voice that might have been Boone's but was too off-key to be certain. She smiled, drew back the covers, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt that had been Edward's, put on the Iron Wolves vest that hung on the back of her bedroom door, the vest with the nightingale patch over the heart. The kitchen was already full when she got downstairs. 10 men, 3 women, and 4 children of various ages all crammed into a space that was designed for 2 people and a cat. Boone was making eggs at the stove. Rowan was arm wrestling with Pike, using his newly rehabilitated left arm, and losing cheerfully. Sullivan sat in the corner with a grandchild on each knee telling a story that was almost certainly exaggerated and absolutely inappropriate for children under 12. Dalton stood by the counter in his police academy uniform, pouring coffee with the careful precision of someone who had been instructed repeatedly not to spill anything in Mrs. Sinclair's kitchen. He had graduated 3rd in his class. Margaret had been in the front row at the ceremony wearing the same dress she had worn to Edward's funeral, sitting between Boone and Sullivan crying for the 2nd time in 8 years. The first time had been at Arlington. This time the tears were for something different. Not grief, not loss, joy. The pure, uncomplicated joy of watching someone you love become the person they were always meant to be. "Good morning, Sleeping Beauty," Boone said, handing her a mug of coffee without looking up from the stove. "French roast, black, no sugar, the way you like it." Margaret took the mug and looked around her kitchen, at the chaos and the noise and the beautiful, improbable mess of it all, at the children chasing each other around the table, at the men who had stood beside her in the darkness and chosen to stay, at the women who had come into their lives since then drawn by the particular magnetism of men who had learned what mattered and were no longer willing to pretend otherwise. She thought of Edward, of the way he would have loved this, would have been right in the middle of it, flipping pancakes and making terrible jokes and sneaking pieces of bacon to the dog they did not have because Margaret had never gotten around to getting one. Maybe she would get a dog, something big and stupid and friendly, the kind of dog that knocked things over with its tail and slept on the couch and made the house feel less empty on the weekday mornings when the Iron Wolves were not there. Or maybe she would not. Maybe the house was not empty anymore. Maybe it had not been empty for a long time. She sipped her coffee and walked to the window. The Bitterroot Mountains stood in the morning light, their peaks white with the last of the winter snow. The lavender beds were just beginning to show green, tiny shoots pushing up through the soil toward a sun they could not see, but somehow knew was there. Behind her, the noise continued. The arguments and the laughter and the clatter of plates and the particular kind of chaos that only existed in places where people felt safe enough to be loud. To be themselves, to take up space in the world without apologizing for it. Margaret Sinclair, Elena Rohr, Nightingale, Catherine Wolfe, Sarah Davidson. She had been all of these women, had worn their names like armor, like disguises, like the shed skins of lives she had lived and left behind. But standing in her kitchen on a Sunday morning in Montana, surrounded by a family she had never expected, and a peace she had never believed possible, she realized that none of those names mattered anymore. What mattered was this: the eggs on the stove, the coffee in her hand, the laughter in her kitchen, the mountains outside her window, The vest on her shoulders with the patch that read Nightingale, not because it was her code name, but because it had become something else entirely. A symbol, a reminder, a promise that even the darkest stories can end in light. She turned away from the window and sat down at the kitchen table. Dalton set a plate of eggs in front of her. Boone refilled her coffee. Sullivan's grandchild climbed into her lap without asking the way children do when they have decided that someone is safe. Margaret looked at the child, small, trusting, completely unaware of the violence that had been done to protect the world she was growing up in. Completely unaware that the old woman holding her had once carried 52 children out of the dark and spent the rest of her life trying to forgive herself for not being able to carry more. The child looked up at her and smiled. Margaret smiled back. Outside, the wind carried the scent of lavender and pine and the first warmth of spring. The mountains stood where they had always stood, patient and eternal, watching over a valley where an old woman had finally found what she had spent her whole life looking for. Not safety. She had had safety. Not purpose. She had had purpose. Not even family, though. That was closer to the truth than anything else. Home. She had found home. And that, Margaret thought as she held the child in her lap and listened to the laughter of the people she loved, was the only ending that had ever mattered.